The man known to history as Pompey the Great or Pompeius Magnus was born Gnaeus Pompeius on the 29th of September 106 BC in Picenum, a region on the Adriatic coast of central Italy. His family was the most powerful in the region. A distant relative named Quintus Pompeius had been consul of Rome in 141 BC, the most important political office in the Roman Republic. The family was not native to Picenum though, and its origins remain unclear. Pompey's father, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, had a great influence on his son's life and career. He was a successful general who came to prominence while campaigning in his native Picenum during the Social War, the conflict between Rome and its erstwhile Italian allies or socii on the Italian peninsula from 91 BC to 87 BC. Pompeius Strabo served as consul in 89 BC and celebrated a triumph at the end of that year. Little is known about Pompey's mother. According to the Roman soldier and historian Marcus Valerius Paterculus, writing in the 1st century AD, she was a woman named Lucilia who came from a family of senatorial rank. She bore Pompeius Strabo 2 children, the future Pompey the Great, and a daughter named Pompeia. Pompey grew up at a time of social and political upheaval. Rome had been a republic since 509 BC, at which time a centuries-old monarchy had been overthrown. The most important political office was the consulship, held by 2 individuals each year. Consuls could not serve successive terms and were expected to wait several years before holding the office again. They also had to have served a political apprenticeship, often lasting decades, before they were considered senior enough to gain election as consul. Despite these constitutional safeguards, Roman society was extremely hierarchical and based on property. The wealthiest landowners dominated the Senate, the main legislative and governing body of the Republic, while senior military commands were held by the equites or equestrians. The Roman army had traditionally been a citizen militia, with soldiers recruited from the propertied classes, though as we will see, this was changing right around the time that Pompey was born. Despite its militia-like nature, the armies of the Republic had emerged as the foremost fighting force in the Mediterranean world in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries BC, allowing Rome to conquer the entire Italian peninsula by 264 BC. Over the next century it defeated its rivals for dominance of the western Mediterranean, Carthage, a similar sort of oligarchic republic based out of what is now Tunisia in North Africa, in the 3 Punic Wars. Thereafter Rome continued to expand aggressively, moving into the eastern Mediterranean, where the old Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged out of the fragmentation of the empire of Alexander the Great were declining in strength. Pompey's career would peak here in the east, waging war on powers like the Seleucid Empire that ruled a sizable empire from Syria and the Kingdom of Pontus that controlled the southern shores of the Black Sea around what is now northern Turkey. The years prior to Pompey's birth had seen Rome continue to expand militarily around the Mediterranean, enriching the Romans with loot stripped from the newly conquered provinces and from slaves brought back to Italy from the conquered regions. Yet it was a time of contrasting fortunes. Abroad Rome's armies seemed invincible, but at home the Republic was fragile. Expansion and great riches had sundered the old social and economic systems of the Republic, and there were constant political tensions in the city of Rome itself. One of the issues was that the Republic's generals were becoming overly powerful and the city's politics were also descending into overt populism, where previously the old patrician noble families had ruled through the Senate in a very conservative manner. A symptom of this instability was the rise of Gaius Marius, a powerful general who came to prominence in 109 BC during the wars against Jugurtha, king of Numidia, a region in northwestern Africa around Algeria today. In 107 BC Marius was elected consul and appointed commander in the Numidian War. It was during this campaign that he began implementing a series of reforms which led to the establishment of the first professional Roman army staffed with legionaries who were full-time career soldiers, rather than part-time soldiers who served a season or 2 in the army before returning to their farms in Italy. The Marian reforms were a common-sense approach to the need for a full-time standing army, given how much the Republic had expanded over the last 100 years, but they also sowed the seeds of the Republic's destruction. Now if powerful and populous generals could win the support of the legions, they had tens of thousands of full-time career soldiers supporting them. While Marius was leading the Numidian War to a successful conclusion, 2 Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, invaded northern Italy in large numbers, posing a major threat to Rome's safety. The Senate now elected Marius to a second consulship in 104 BC and gave him the responsibility of defeating the Germanic tribes. After rebuilding the legions on the northern frontier, Marius turned the tide of the war and served an unprecedented 5 consecutive terms as consul between 104 and 100 BC. In the meantime, Rome's allies on the Italian peninsula continued to clamor for full Roman citizenship. This would eventually lead to the Social War in 91 BC, a 4-year conflict which the Romans emerged victorious in by 87 BC, but which still ended in Rome conceding the honor of Roman citizenship to its Italian allies around the peninsula. This was the last mass enfranchisement of subject people for 3 centuries. It would not be replicated until citizenship was extended to all free citizens of the empire in the early 3rd century AD. From Pompey's perspective, the significance of the Social War was that his father was elected to serve as consul in 89 BC in the midst of it and played a prominent role in the war, notably in the siege of the Italian stronghold of Osculum in the north. While little else is known about his upbringing, the young Pompey is presumed to have gained his military experience serving in his father's army during the conflict. Another young man who served under Pompeius Strabo was Marcus Tullius Cicero, who would later achieve fame as an orator and statesman, though there is no evidence that he and Pompey were closely acquainted at this early time. During his consulship in 89 BC, Pompey's father introduced a law to confer Latin rights to the Traspodane Gauls living north of the river Pa, who remained loyal to Rome. These rights brought commercial privileges and were considered the first step to full Roman citizenship. Prior to celebrating his triumph in Rome on the 25th of December, 89 BC, Pompeius Strabo made an unsuccessful attempt to secure another term as consul. Instead, Strabo's distant relation Quintus Pompeius Rufus took office in 88 BC. Cornelius Sulla, another general who had emerged as major rival of Marius for power in the Republic and who served as consul in 88 BC, considered Strabo's army a threat to Rome and arranged for his consular colleague to take command, but Pompeius Rufus was soon murdered on Strabo's orders. The latter took the army back to Picenum, while Sulla departed to lead a campaign against King Mithridates VI of Pontus in the Black Sea region, who took advantage of Rome's preoccupation in the Social War to invade Roman territory in Asia Minor. In 87 BC, civil war broke out between the 2 consuls, Lucius Cornelius Cinna and Gnaeus Octavius. Cinna championed the cause of the new citizens, while Octavius sided with the conservatives. Although the former was driven out of Rome, he formed an alliance with Marius and advanced on the city. The Social War was just the most consequential of numerous wars being fought by and within the Roman Republic in the 90s and 80s BC. In the midst of it, in 88 BC, Marius's younger rival for power, Sulla, marched with an army on Rome in order to coerce the Senate into granting him control over the army that was to be sent east to wage war on King Mithridates of Pontus, an unprecedented act of military aggression by a Roman general within Italy itself. The minor civil war that broke out between factions supporting Gnaeus Octavius and Lucius Cornelius Cinna, both of whom were aligned in different ways with Marius and Sulla, was an extension of this clash between the Marians and the Sullans. Even the death of Marius in 86 BC simply saw leadership of the Marian faction passed to his son and namesake and another figure by the name of Gnaeus Papirius Carbo. Hence the years ahead would continue to see ongoing conflict between the Marian and Sullan factions. Pompeius Strabo sought to benefit his own cause during this tumultuous period. However, his corruption seems to have led his own men to murder him in 87 BC, though the circumstances of his death are not entirely clear. It's possible that he also simply succumbed to some disease at the time. His death made Pompey the new leader of his family politically. He soon had to stand trial to answer charges concerning his father's corruption and embezzlement of public money during the siege of Osculum. He was ultimately acquitted, though observers noted that a few days later he married Antistia, the daughter of one of the judges. The union would end in a divorce a few years later, having not produced any children. Little is known of Pompey's whereabouts for the next 3 years. With Sulla absent in the east, Cinna and Carbo dominated the political scene in Rome. The Greco-Roman historical biographer of the 2nd century AD, Plutarch, in his Life of Pompey, one of our foremost sources on Pompey the Great, states that he became a partisan of Cinna's during these years and fled from Rome around the time that Cinna was assassinated in 84 BC. Cinna's death left Carbo and Marius Jnr in control of the government at Rome, spurring Sulla to return to Italy in 83 BC after making peace with Mithridates in the east. This began what is known as Sulla's Civil War. Although his father had been no friend of Sulla, Pompey now tied his fortunes to the general, raising a force of troops to aid him in his war against the Marians. Sulla further secured his new alliance with Pompey by offering his stepdaughter Emilia in marriage. She was already pregnant with her recently divorced husband's child and died in childbirth a few months later. Meanwhile, with Sulla marching on Rome from the south, Marius the Younger led an army to meet him, while Carbo went north to deal with a Sullan army led by Metellus Pius, Pompey, and another man who would figure prominently in Pompey's story in years to come, Marcus Crassus. Ultimately, Sulla defeated the Marians outside Rome at the Battle of the Colline Gate on the 1st of November, 82 BC. Carbo fled towards North Africa to raise a new army, following which Sulla dispatched Pompey to pursue him. Carbo only got as far as Sicily when he was apprehended and executed by Pompey, an act that led some to label him Agila Sentilis Carnifex, the young butcher. After entering Rome, Sulla was the unrivaled political and military figure within the Roman Republic and claimed the power of dictators, a position which existed within the Republic whereby a political figure or general could be temporarily given extraordinary powers during an emergency. Sulla argued that the threat to the Republic posed by his opponents merited such measures. In reality, though, he used the dictatorial powers to engage in a notorious series of proscriptions whereby lists of his political enemies, primarily former Marian supporters, were drawn up and the individuals on it were either executed or exiled. While the original list only applied to 80 people, many more names were added to the proscriptions by unscrupulous men who wished to settle personal scores and lay claim to the victim's property. Sulla used his dictatorship to strengthen the Senate by doubling its size and adding many individuals from the old Roman aristocracy. Conversely, he sought to weaken the powers of the tribunes, magistrates who represented the Roman plebeian classes or commoners. Thus, he emerged firmly as a ruler who favored the Optimates or conservative, tradition-bound faction within the Republic that wanted power to remain firmly in the hands of the aristocratic Senate, while trying to weaken the populars, the populist faction who appealed more to the wider population for their support. Then, having seemingly restored stability to the Republic, Sulla relinquished his powers of dictators in 79 BC and went into retirement in the Italian countryside. He died the following year. While all of these events were occurring in Rome, Pompey had remained in Sicily to reorganize the troops on the island after his defeat of Carbo. He was then ordered to lead a campaign against Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus in Africa, who had allied there with Hyarbas, the king of Numidia. In little more than a month, Pompey defeated Domitius and Hyarbas in battle in quick succession, capturing and executing both of them in the process. As a result of this victorious campaign, Pompey was hailed as Magnus or the Great by his troops on account of his significant military victories at such a young age. He henceforth styled himself as Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Pompey was also said to bear a strong physical resemblance to Alexander the Great, and the new cognomen strengthened his association with the Macedonian conqueror. Fueled by a sense of his elevated prestige, he refused Sulla's order to disband his army and returned to Rome until such time as the dictator agreed to allow him to hold a triumph in the city, a parade that conquering Roman generals had traditionally held upon their return home. Sulla reluctantly agreed, even though Pompey was a young man who had not attained the necessary senatorial rank to receive the honor of a triumph. On the 12th of March, 81 BC, at the age of only 24, Pompey was saluted as imperator or commander at Rome as he celebrated the first of what would be 3 triumphs in the city. In 79 BC, Pompey married Mutia Tertia, his third wife in just 7 years. In the period that followed, he capitalized on the renown he had gained during Sulla's civil war, involving himself in the politics of the Republic as the dictator went into retirement, and figures like Sulla's old ally, Quintus Lutatius Catullus, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, vied for prominence. Pompey supported Lepidus' candidacy to become consul, something which led Sulla, who was not in favor of Lepidus' rise, to cut Pompey out of his will. Yet, when Sulla died later in 78 BC, Pompey helped to organize the proceedings in the Roman Forum. He was also soon bestowed with a new military command after an insurrection broke out in Etruria, a part of Italy where Sulla had granted his military veterans land at the expense of the local population. This subsequently morphed into further civil unrest as Lepidus engaged in an effort to seize power throughout Italy, during which Pompey was appointed to a senior command. Pompey confronted a Roman commander, Lepidus' second-in-command, by the name of Marcus Junius Brutus at Mutina, present-day Medina. Pompey appears to have negotiated Brutus' surrender and promised to write to the Senate for further instructions, but the following day Pompey had him executed, further enhancing his reputation for ruthlessness among his enemies. At the end of this latest victorious campaign, Catullus ordered Pompey to disband his army. Pompey refused, recognizing that he would lose his influence. Instead he held out for a new command. For 2 years, Metellus Pius, a figure who Pompey had fought alongside in northern Italy during Sulla's civil war, had been fighting in Hispania, modern-day Spain, against Quintus Sertorius, an old ally of the deceased Marian leader, Cinna. Sertorius had managed to carve out a stronghold for himself in Hispania, which had become a base for the old Marian cause within the provinces. Pompey was ordered to join Metellus in Spain. The campaign was far from straightforward. He spent 77 BC facing fierce resistance from Gallic tribes encroaching into northern Hispania and the Roman possessions along the French Riviera from the Alps and the Pyrenees. A talented general and politician, Sertorius worked together with local elites and allowed them a greater share of political power than under official Roman occupation. Pompey knew that the terrain in Hispania was difficult and focused on securing control of the ports in the south and east to keep his army supplied by sea, but he made little progress during 76 BC. He attempted to trap Sertorius as he was besieging the city of Lauren on the east coast, but Sertorius' cavalry charged against Pompey's infantry with devastating impact. Pompey was surrounded by Sertorius at his camp and could not launch a counterattack without exposing his rear and flank. Metellus' arrival on the scene prevented a complete disaster and Sertorius withdrew. The following year, Pompey was more successful and captured Valencia. Then, rather than waiting for Metellus to join him, he became overconfident and attacked Sertorius at the river Sucro, a move which led to a victory for Sertorius. Shortly afterwards Metellus arrived and once again obliged Sertorius to withdraw. During the next major engagement, fought on the banks of the river Turia near Saguntum, the two armies fought each other to a standstill in a fierce battle during which Pompey's brother-in-law, Gaius Memmius, was killed. Pompey had little to show for 3 years of campaigning and complained to the Senate about a lack of funds and supplies. His request for reinforcement was granted by the consuls for 74 BC, Lucius Licinius Lucullus and Marcus Aurelius Cotta, who were about to embark on campaign against King Mithridates, Sulla's old nemesis who had once again taken up arms against Rome in the east. With the arrival of 2 additional legions, Metellus and Pompey made progress. Sertorius was losing the support of his Spanish allies, and in 73 BC his subordinate Marcus Perperna Veiento assassinated him. With Sertorius out of the picture, Metellus returned to Rome, leaving Pompey to deal with Perperna. Unlike his predecessor, who preferred to avoid battle unless he enjoyed significant numerical superiority, Perperna sought a pitched battle and was soon ambushed by Pompey's men. Perperna was captured and executed along with his associates who were responsible for Sertorius' assassination. Following Sertorius' death, southern and eastern Hispania were fully pacified, though parts of the Iberian Peninsula would remain turbulent for decades to come. Pompey remained in Hispania for several months to reorganize the provinces and build his own following among Sertorius' former supporters. At the end of 72 BC, he was on his way to Rome to assist in the suppression of the slave rebellion led by the Thracian gladiator Spartacus, which broke out the previous year. Initial rebel victories caused the Senate to panic, and it was up to Crassus, the figure Pompey had commanded alongside many years earlier and who had since become the wealthiest man in Rome, to raise 6 legions and lead them against the rebels while the Senate recalled Pompey from Spain. After defeating part of the rebel army, Crassus pursued them to the heel of Italy and blockaded them there. Crassus hoped to defeat Spartacus on his own to prevent Pompey from sharing the glory. Spartacus managed to break out of Crassus' blockade on the 3rd attempt, but his army gradually disintegrated and was defeated piecemeal. A 5,000-strong column ran into Pompey's legions and was easily defeated, enabling Pompey to claim that he had dealt the final blow against the rebels. Pompey approached Rome but refused to enter the city without being granted a second triumph for his victories in Spain. Although Pompey remained an equestrian, the Senate granted his request and exempted him from the age requirement Sulla had reintroduced to elect him consul for the year 70 BC alongside Crassus. After entering Rome in triumph in December 71 BC, Pompey took office as consul for 70 BC at the youthful age of 35, with Crassus serving as the other consul for the year. He was the most inexperienced individual to hold the post, since he was still not a senator, and had not served in the usual string of more junior magistracies prior to becoming consul. While his father Strabo had been consul back in 89 BC, he had spent most of the year on campaign at the end of the Social War. Conversely, Pompey entered office with an ambitious reform program. Top of the agenda was to restore the power of the tribunes which Sulla had limited as dictator. Several similar initiatives had been presented to the Senate in previous years, and with both Pompey and Crassus in favor of restoring the tribunician power, the Senate decided that it was better for the people to have a constitutional means to voice their grievances than to enable demagogues to stir up trouble by unconstitutional means. They also reintroduced a check on consular power by reviving the office of censor that had been abolished by Sulla. Beyond this, not much was accomplished, and the two ambitious consuls did not work effectively together. For the next few years, with the Roman Republic broadly at peace for the first time in a great many years, Pompey had few military commands which he could attempt to acquire and retired to his country estate, his political career on something of a hiatus after his term as consul. There he raised his young family. He and his third wife Mucia had had a son named Gnaeus in 79 BC soon after they married. A daughter Pompeia had followed around 75 BC, though the exact year of her birth is not entirely clear. Finally, in 67 BC they had another son named Sextus. Although he was not reputed to be as wealthy as Crassus, who had benefited enormously from seizing the estates of Sulla's enemies back in the late 80s BC during the proscriptions of the Marians, Pompey's family estates in Picenum continued to bring in a healthy income. He kept an eye on political affairs in Rome, though he was aware that it was unusual for anyone to follow up a consulship with a second one again quickly, while his efforts to secure the magisterial office for some of his supporters during this period generally floundered. Ultimately, Pompey was more of a military man than a career senator, and he was watching and waiting during these years for a new military command. An opportunity finally opened up for Pompey in 67 BC when the tribune Aulus Gabinius proposed Pompey as the commander of a fleet 200 ships to confront the pirates in the Mediterranean. For several decades, piracy in the Mediterranean had disrupted the grain supply into Rome and endangered the lives of Romans traveling between the provinces by sea. The frequent wars with Mithridates of Pontus and the Seleucid Empire had further encouraged pirates from Cilicia along the southern coast of Turkey to attack Roman settlements in the eastern Mediterranean. According to Plutarch, when the young Gaius Julius Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates on his way to Rhodes in 75 BC, he scoffed that his captors had set his ransom too low and offered to pay a significantly higher rate. After spending a month with his captors while his associates raised the money, he took their leave and promised to come back and have them crucified one day. The pirates had also been a thorn in Pompey's side during his campaign against Sertorius in Spain, but piecemeal attempts by Roman commanders failed to eliminate the threat. The Senate recognized that a different approach was required after a pirate fleet attacked the harbor at Ostia in 67 BC. Under Gabinius' proposals, Pompey's authority would extend over the whole of the Mediterranean and up to 50 miles inland. Gabinius faced considerable opposition among the senators, who were concerned about giving Pompey such extensive powers over much of the Roman world. However, he eventually overcame the senatorial opposition. A second law was soon enacted to appoint Pompey to his command, and he was given control over an enormous fleet of over 250 ships with upwards of 100,000 soldiers and mariners. Pompey approached the challenge of ridding the Mediterranean of the pirates methodically, dividing what the Romans were coming to know as Mare Nostrum, our sea, into at least 15 regions, each under one of his sub-commanders. He began his campaign by focusing on the western Mediterranean, enabling the secure transport of corn from Sardinia, Sicily, and North Africa to feed the masses of Roman citizens in Rome and Italy. While these measures were extraordinarily successful, Pompey was being undermined by the consul Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senatorial opponent who was due to govern Transalpine Gaul in southern France after the end of his consular term. Piso used his influence to prevent the province from cooperating with Pompey's agents, creating difficulties for the general and pointing yet again to the constant cutthroat nature of Roman politics during these years. Next, Pompey ordered his legates to blockade the eastern Mediterranean ports except for those in Cilicia in order to encourage the pirates to return to their home base. He then proceeded to engage the pirates in a decisive battle at Coracesium in Cilicia, now the Turkish port of Alanya, where Pompey forced his enemies to surrender. He resettled the defeated pirates among several cities in Cilicia, including the port of Soli, which he renamed Pompeiopolis, the city of Pompey, in his own honor. Pompey had been given 3 years to carry out the task of eliminating the pirates, and while he did not eradicate them entirely, within months he had largely cleared the entire Mediterranean of piratical activity. Pompey soon received word that he had been appointed in 66 BC to succeed Lucius Licinius Lucullus as commander in the ongoing war against Mithridates of Pontus. Lucullus had been in the region since 73 BC and had initially achieved great success, driving the enemy out of the Roman province of Bithynia and occupying much of Pontus itself. Mithridates fled to Armenia and sought aid from King Tigranes II, his son-in-law. Despite defeating Tigranes at the Battle of Tigranocerta in October 69 BC and occupying his capital, Artaxata, Lucullus soon lost the confidence of his troops, enabling Mithridates and Tigranes to regain all their territory. From 69 BC, the Senate began to have doubts about Lucullus' capacity to win the war and gradually reduced his authority. Then, in 66 BC, the tribune Gaius Manlius successfully passed a bill in the Senate recalling Lucullus and appointing Pompey to his command. Pompey retained command of the men and ships he was given for the pirate war, enabling him to use his fleet to secure his lines of communication to Rome and combine the men already under his command with Lucullus' old army. He was given wide-ranging authority over the Roman provinces in the eastern Mediterranean, allowing him to appoint several close associates as his legates, including Lucius Afranius, his old comrade from the war against Sertorius in Hispania, as well as his wife's half-brother, Quintus Metellus Celer, and his ally in Rome, Aulus Gabinius. With these he would embark on his greatest campaign yet. Pompey began with a diplomatic initiative to isolate Mithridates by encouraging King Phraates III of Parthia, a great kingdom which then ruled over Persia and Mesopotamia in what are now Iran and Iraq, to invade Armenia and distract Tigranes. Early in the campaign, Pompey had an ill-humored meeting with Lucullus, who labeled him a vulture and accused him of stealing the glory that he was about to obtain by winning victory over the kingdom of Pontus. Lucullus soon left for Rome, taking only 1,600 men with him to the capital, where he would face a major struggle to be awarded a triumph in recognition of his victories in the east. Several years of warfare had already left the kingdom of Pontus devastated, and Mithridates had pursued a scorched-earth strategy to deprive the advancing Roman legions of food and supplies. The king was obliged to leave his initial defensive position as his water supply was running low and his army was defeated in battle by Pompey at the river Lycus in 66 BC. Mithridates escaped with 800 horsemen and attempted to seek refuge with Tigranes once again, but on this occasion he was refused aid by the Armenians. The elder Tigranes was keen to end the war quickly and agreed to give up his conquests and become a vassal of Rome, although Armenia would remain a buffer state for centuries thereafter, constantly changing its loyalties between the Romans and the Parthians. Although Pompey had defeated Mithridates and forced Tigranes to submit, he continued to face opposition from smaller kingdoms in the region. In 65 BC, he was attacked by Oroeses, ruler of the ancient kingdom of Albania, a state which lay in the eastern Caucasus, roughly modern Azerbaijan, not to be confused with Albania in the western Balkans. Pompey and his lieutenants defeated the Albanians in battle and Oroeses made peace later that year. He then launched a preemptive invasion of neighboring Iberia, forcing King Artaces to come to terms. The Albanians took advantage of Pompey's absence to resume hostilities and were decisively defeated at the river Abas, which may refer to the river Alazani on the border of Georgia and Azerbaijan. Pompey adopted a tactic he first encountered among Sertorius' men in Hispania, ordering his infantry to kneel down behind the cavalry to conceal them from the enemy. When the Albanians attacked, the Roman cavalry fell back behind the infantrymen, who stood up and closed ranks to meet the charge. Pompey's horsemen wheeled around and enveloped the enemy on both flanks. Following this victory, Pompey was confident enough to send his subordinates to secure key strategic areas while he led the remainder of his army on an exploratory expedition towards the Caspian Sea, this being as far into the region as any Roman army had traversed. By 64 BC, Pompey was confident enough to send some of his subordinates back to Rome to shore up his political position in the capital. He then led his army south into Syria. Here he faced the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, a once great power, though one which had been hugely weakened by numerous wars with Rome stretching back to the 190s BC and also by the rise of the Parthian Empire on its eastern flank and the Armenians to the north. Following his victory over Tigranes in 69 BC, Lucullus had recognized the Seleucid king Antiochus XIII as the legitimate ruler of Syria. However, Pompey intended for Syria, a very wealthy part of the Mediterranean world, to become a Roman province and waged a swift and devastating war against the Seleucids. He had King Antiochus deposed and killed before turning his attention to Judea, which was in the midst of a power struggle between the brothers Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, members of the Hasmonean dynasty of native Jewish rulers. While Aristobulus enjoyed the advantage, Hyrcanus formed an alliance with Aretas, the ruler of the neighboring kingdom of Nabatea, the rulers of which had grown rich in their great city of Petra by controlling the spice caravan routes between the Mediterranean and Arabia. The Romans arrived while Aretas was besieging Jerusalem and forced him to break the siege. Then, in the spring of 63 BC, Pompey met the warring brothers in Damascus and offered a peace deal. While Hyrcanus was inclined to accept, Aristobulus returned to Jerusalem intent on fighting the Romans. He soon changed his mind and surrendered, but the inhabitants continued to resist for 3 months. After entering Jerusalem, Hyrcanus was installed by Pompey as ruler of Judea, but he had to settle for the title of high priest rather than king. The kingdom of Judea was established by Pompey as a client state or vassal of Rome. Pompey had now conquered virtually all of the states that had continued to resist Roman rule in the eastern Mediterranean through a series of swift and immensely successful military campaigns between 66 BC and 63 BC. After receiving news that Mithridates, who had fled to the lands on the northern end of the Black Sea, had ordered his own men to slay him, Pompey began to reorganize the newly conquered territories into Roman provinces and client kingdoms. Then he set sail for Italy. In late 62 BC, he landed at Brundisium in the south of the peninsula and promptly dismissed his army to quell fears that he might try to emulate Sulla and march on Rome. The general and his entourage were welcomed on their way to Rome, but a faction in the Senate that was opposed to the rise of a new all-conquering general in the vein of Marius or Sulla was anxious to prevent him from acquiring too much power. Even before he arrived in Rome, Pompey requested a divorce from his wife Mucia, perhaps in the hope of entering into a new marriage alliance with the family of the young orator and rising leader of the Optimates faction in the Senate, Marcus Porcius Cato. The incorruptible Cato rejected Pompey's overtures and would become one of Pompey's leading critics, though they would soon find common ground against a rising populist politician, Gaius Julius Caesar. In September 61 BC, Pompey celebrated his third triumph, a magnificent 2-day spectacle that coincided with his 45th birthday. It was highly unusual for any Roman general to celebrate 3 triumphs in his lifetime, let alone to do so by his mid-40s, something which points towards Pompey's exalted status in the Republic after his Asian campaign. The wealth of the East had enabled Pompey to make a generous payment to his men and bestow a vast sum into Rome's state coffers. The general also increased his personal fortune, allowing him to build a house at the Pincian Hill in Rome and a large villa outside Rome. He ordered the construction of the city's first permanent theater in the Campus Martius or Field of Mars outside the gates of Rome, a move designed to curry favor with the common people of Rome. His political priorities in the Senate were to secure a land settlement for his army veterans and to acquire official recognition of his reorganization of the eastern provinces, efforts which met with some resistance. He found a surprise ally in eventually achieving these goals when Julius Caesar gained election as consul in 59 BC. Pompey, Caesar, and a third individual, Marcus Crassus, whom Pompey had campaigned alongside against Spartacus' revolt over a decade earlier, now formed a political alliance known as the First Triumvirate. Caesar, who at this stage was the more junior partner living in the shadows of the glory Pompey had acquired over 2 decades of successful military campaigns, managed to engineer the passage of legislation through the Senate to reward Pompey's veterans with land and wealth, while Pompey now married Caesar's daughter Julia, who was only around 17 years old at the time, to cement the political alliance. Pompey's surprise alliance with Caesar complicated his relations with more conservative and traditional senators like Cato and Cicero. In 59 BC, Pompey and Caesar attempted to undermine Cicero by supporting his political rival, Publius Clodius Pulcher, a dangerous demagogue from the wealthy and privileged Claudian family. As an elite patrician, Clodius was prevented from becoming a tribune, but Pompey and Caesar arranged for Clodius to be adopted by a plebeian man who immediately emancipated him, making him eligible to be elected as a plebeian tribune. After securing the office for 58 BC, Clodius attacked Cicero. He convened a meeting in which he denounced the great orator for his handling of a political emergency in Rome known as the Catilinarian conspiracy that had occurred back in 63 BC during Cicero's term as consul. While Cicero went into voluntary exile as a result of these attacks, Clodius continued his assault on his reputation and passed a law declaring him to be an enemy of the state, leading to the confiscation of his property. Pompey may have hoped that his acquiescence to Clodius' anti-Cicero measures would advantage him in the short term, but then Clodius, believing he could dispense with his former allies as his power base grew, sought to interfere with Pompey's organization of the East. Pompey therefore engaged in a volte-face and began lobbying for Cicero's recall. Several attempts to do so were vetoed by Clodius and his allies, and it was only in September 57 BC that Cicero was able to return to Rome. As part of his political vendetta against Cicero, Clodius attempted to instigate riots in the city by manipulating the supply of grain to Rome's masses. With Cicero's backing, Pompey was given a temporary commission to regulate the grain supply. While his efforts temporarily restored Pompey's popularity among the people, Clodius continued to instigate opposition to Pompey in 56 BC. In response to these actions, and despite his discomfort with Caesar, who after his term as consul in 59 BC had elected to become governor of Gaul and was then engaged in a series of spectacularly successful military campaigns there throughout the 50s BC, ones which saw him threaten to eclipse the achievements of Pompey in the 70s and 60s BC, Pompey nevertheless renewed the first triumvirate alliance with Caesar and Crassus at a meeting in Lucca in 56 BC. Pompey and Crassus were then elected as the two consuls for 55 BC, the second time the two men had held the office together, as the trio effectively began to divide up political power within the republic between them. Caesar would continue his conquests in Gaul, even crossing over twice to Britain in 55 and 54 BC as he considered the feasibility of a military conquest of the south of the island with its rich tin mines, while Crassus headed east to Syria, where he now sought his own military renown through a successful war with the Parthian Empire. At home in Rome, Pompey inaugurated his theater in the city in August 55 BC after years of building work. Still, he must have been conscious that of the three members of the alliance he appeared very much as the lion in winter, the general whose glory days were behind him while Caesar garnered acclaim for his actions in Gaul. In late 55 BC, Crassus departed for Syria and embarked on his disastrous Parthian campaign, which would culminate in his defeat and death at the Battle of Carrhae in June 53 BC. Pompey delegated his provincial commands to loyal subordinates and chose to remain in Rome. While he was unassailable in the Senate, his supporters and associates were targeted. In September 54 BC, Pompey's friend Aulus Gabinius was put on trial for treason for intervening in Egypt on his own initiative while serving as governor of Syria. Although he was acquitted, he was found guilty of extortion and exiled. Around the same time, Pompey suffered a personal tragedy when his wife Julia died during childbirth. For the time being, his alliance with Caesar remained secure, and the latter suggested that he should marry Caesar's great-niece Octavia, while Caesar would divorce his wife Calpurnia to marry Pompey's daughter Pompeia, though Pompey did not agree to this arrangement. In the meantime, there was a breakdown of political order in Rome, and the consular elections for 53 BC were delayed by a year, with the result that the two consuls were elected halfway into their terms. As the political unrest spilled into January 52 BC, Clodius was killed in the violence racking the capital. His supporters responded by burning his body inside the Senate House, destroying the building in the process. The Senate convened in an alternative venue, and on the 1st of February passed a measure making Pompey sole consul for the year. Pompey spent the next few months restoring political order in Rome. He appointed Metellus Scipio as his consular colleague for the remainder of the year and married Scipio's daughter, Cornelia Metella, the widow of Crassus' son Publius, who had been killed at Carrhae alongside his father. Some of Pompey's efforts to restore order during this period by eliminating corrupt practices undermined the interests of his ally Julius Caesar, who had sent his lieutenant, Mark Antony, to Rome to try and gain election as quaestor and then tribune. Caesar feared that he would be put on trial for his actions as consul in 59 BC. While he enjoyed immunity from prosecution as a provincial governor, once recalled to Rome he would be vulnerable and needed allies in prominent offices to offset the possibility of this happening. Caesar hoped that before he returned to Rome he could be elected consul in absentia so that he could begin his term immediately after celebrating a triumph and retain his immunity. While Pompey granted the right for Caesar to stand for election in absentia, he also passed a law preventing anyone else from doing so. In order to prevent consular candidates from bribing their way to the office by relying on future income as provincial governors, Pompey passed a measure introducing a 5-year interval between a consulship and a provincial governorship. The Gallic Wars were over and Pompey's legislation strengthened calls for Caesar's recall. Effectively, this signaled the collapse of the First Triumvirate. In the spring of 50 BC, Pompey seemed to indicate his support for a proposal to extend Caesar's term to November, enabling him to be elected consul for the following year, return to Rome and hold a triumph at the end of the year. However, the proposal was blocked by the tribune Scribonius Curio, who had recently become Caesar's ally, indicating that Caesar did not trust Pompey's intentions. At various times, both Caesar and Pompey suggested that both should agree to lay down their commands, but neither could feel secure without an army backing them. By the end of the year, with rumors abounding that Caesar was marching south towards Rome in violation of the law that generals could not bring legions into Italy south of the river Rubicon, Pompey agreed to take command of 2 legions to defend the city. On January 7, 49 BC, the Senate authorized Roman officials in Italy to take whatever measures they considered necessary to protect the state. Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, 2 tribunes who supported Caesar, were threatened by the Senate and fled Rome, heading for Caesar's camp near the river Rubicon, which marked the border between Italy and the province of Cisalpine Gaul. While Caesar only had the 13th legion at his disposal, on the night of the 10th of January, 49 BC, he made the momentous decision to cross the Rubicon. Additional forces were also being led south towards Italy from throughout Gaul. Pompey was surprised by Caesar's decision to march on Rome with only limited forces during the winter and did not have time to raise an army to defend the capital. He decided to abandon the city on the 17th of January and summoned all officials to join him at his camp at Capua in southern Italy. He had the support of a large section of the more conservative element within the Senate, the Optimates faction, splitting the republic politically as these senators left the capital to join the Pompeian forces. Thus, Caesar's actions in crossing the river Rubicon initiated a new civil war. Pompey may have decided to leave Rome itself to spare the city and its inhabitants from bloodshed, while his subordinate Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus attempted to make a stand in northern Italy. When Pompey refused to come to his aid, Domitius surrendered to Caesar, and his 13,000 men joined Caesar's ranks. Pompey then prepared to evacuate the whole of Italy and assembled a fleet at Brundisium. By the time Caesar reached the port in early March, most of Pompey's army had already crossed the Adriatic. Meanwhile, with Rome left open to him to occupy it and the rump Senate firmly comprised of his supporters, Caesar had the power of dictators that Sulla had claimed over 3 decades earlier bestowed on him. Unlike Sulla, Caesar would never voluntarily relinquish these powers. Pompey's escape from Brundisium gave him the strategic advantage. He could train up his army in Greece, drawing further forces to him from around the eastern Mediterranean, while troops in Hispania that favored Pompey's cause threatened Caesar from the west. Caesar could not find enough ships to pursue Pompey, although he managed to take Sardinia and sent Curio to expel Cato from Sicily. Curio then landed in North Africa, where he was killed in battle against King Juba of Numidia. Caesar led 6 legions to Hispania and gained the upper hand against Pompey's subordinates, while Pompey recruited a large number of men and ships in the east. After briefly returning to Rome to organize elections for the year 48 BC, Caesar headed for Brundisium, determined to pursue Pompey and bring him to a decisive battle. His fleet was still not large enough and he could only take 15,000 men with him in a single crossing, leaving the rest with Mark Antony. Caesar set sail on the 4th of January. While Pompey's fleet commander Bibulus failed to stop him, he destroyed dozens of Caesar's transport ships as they returned to Brundisium. Pompey had dispersed his troops into winter quarters at Dyrrhachium and Apollonia in Illyricum, modern-day Albania. After taking control of Apollonia, Caesar moved on to Dyrrhachium but was unable to dislodge Pompey. Then Antony crossed the Adriatic in late March to reinforce Caesar. Pompey hoped to ambush him and prevent him from joining Caesar, but his plans were leaked and he had to return to Dyrrhachium. While Pompey could count on supplies reaching him by sea and hoped to starve Caesar of supplies, Caesar took steps to restrict Pompey's access to fresh water on land. In July, Pompey successfully broke through Caesar's lines but failed to win a complete victory. The stage was now set for the final showdown between Caesar and Pompey. With the breaking of the blockade, Caesar decided to march east towards Macedonia, where one of his subcommanders, Domitius Calvinus, was facing 2 legions under Metellus Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law. Rather than turn to invade Italy, Pompey now decided to march to Scipio's aid and followed Caesar eastwards. By August, the 2 armies faced each other near Pharsalus in southern Thessaly. Pompey was encamped at the top of a hill, while Caesar deployed his legions on the plain below. Caesar sought to tempt Pompey into a pitched battle on several occasions. While Pompey initially held firm, a few days later he changed his mind and engaged Caesar in battle, confident that he could gain victory with 38,000 infantry to Caesar's 22,000 and a much superior cavalry force. Pompey envisaged his cavalry making the decisive attack against Caesar's right flank. hammering Caesar's army against the anvil of his infantry. However, Caesar observed the movements of Pompey's cavalry commander Labienus and ambushed him with 1,000 of his own cavalry. Although Pompey's center and right held, Caesar's cavalry tore through his left and Pompey was forced to flee. Despite his significant numerical superiority, Pompey had been defeated at Pharsalus, an engagement which would prove to be the decisive clash of the civil war. Many of Pompey's subordinates were killed or captured by Caesar at Pharsalus, but Pompey was determined to rebuild an army to continue the fight. He sailed to Asia Minor and received some reinforcements there, picking up his wife Cornelia from Mytilene along the way. After considering his options, Pompey decided to seek refuge in Egypt from the teenage king Ptolemy XIII. Ptolemy was involved in a power struggle with his sister, wife, and co-ruler Cleopatra VII, and his advisors believed that it was better to make a deal with the victorious Caesar, and ordered the Roman officer Lucius Septimius to assassinate Pompey as he landed at Pelusium on the Nile Delta on the 28th of September, 48 BC, one day before his 58th birthday. 3 days later, Caesar arrived in Egypt and was presented with Pompey's head. He was disgusted to find his rival and former ally dead, and may have intended to display his magnanimity towards Pompey in victory by pardoning him. Caesar would soon return to Rome triumphant and would hold the power of dictators there down to his assassination in 44 BC. He would never proclaim himself to be an all-powerful ruler or emperor, but his actions paved the way for his great-nephew, Octavian, to rise as the first emperor of Rome in 27 BC after defeating Mark Antony in a power struggle to succeed to Caesar's position of preeminence within the Republic. Ironically, when Caesar was killed in 44 BC, it was during a meeting of the Senate in the theater of Pompey. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was one of the foremost generals and political figures of Roman history, a man who was known as the Great even in his own time. Beginning in his early 20s, he commenced a military career which saw him win renown fighting first for Sulla during the civil war that brought him to power and then in campaigns against Sertorius in Hispania and Spartacus in southern Italy. Yet it was his lengthy campaigns in the eastern Mediterranean in the 60s BC that truly won him acclaim, defeating the Cilician pirates and then moving on to engage in a series of brilliant campaigns that reduced the kingdoms of Pontus and Judea, along with the Seleucid Empire, to Roman rule. As a result of these, he was awarded 3 triumphs at Rome by his 45th year, an unprecedented accomplishment. His tragedy was that he was eclipsed in the 50s BC by Julius Caesar, with Pompey's exploits becoming a distant memory as news seemed to arrive every month of fresh successes for Caesar in Gaul. Yet Pompey's historical legacy was assured when he led the conservative senatorial resistance to Caesar's efforts to seize power after crossing the Rubicon early in 49 BC. In doing so, Pompey, though quickly defeated, appeared to be the great champion of the Roman Republic, though whether he sought to preserve the Republic or wanted to simply claim power for himself instead of Caesar remains open to question. What do you think of Pompey the Great? Was he a brilliant leader who helped Rome to win great honor and prestige and defended the traditions of the Roman Republic, or was he a power-hungry despot himself who was simply outmaneuvered by Julius Caesar in the struggle for absolute power within the Roman Republic? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
This is a special partnership project between Epic History and Drake. Back in 1792, the French Revolution started a massive war across Europe that went on for an entire generation. It was a huge fight for control over Europe and the entire world. This war happened both on land and at sea. Throughout all the changing partnerships and enemies, one rivalry never ended: the fight between France and Britain. Britain couldn't match France when it came to fighting on land. But when it came to the ocean, things were completely different. Britain's Royal Navy ruled the seas just like Napoleon would later rule the battlefields. During this time, when Britain had many talented sea captains, one man stood far above everyone else: Horatio Nelson. He was brave, inspiring, and absolutely brilliant at what he did. For the British people, he became both a national hero and a living legend. This is the story of his most famous sea battle. The year was 1805. The brief peace between Britain and France had completely fallen apart, and the two enemies were fighting each other once again. Britain joined forces with Russia and Austria to create what they called the Third Coalition. Napoleon renewed France's partnership with Spain. The man who had just crowned himself Emperor of the French was absolutely determined to finally crush Britain once and for all. Britain was the country that paid for all the alliances working against him, destroyed French trade around the world, and blocked French ports from getting supplies. Napoleon had gathered a huge invasion army along the coast of the English Channel. His battle-tested soldiers would easily defeat the British forces, but only if he could control the Channel waters long enough to get his troops safely across to England. The British Navy was better than the French in both the number of ships they had and the skill of their sailors, but even the British couldn't be in every place at the same time. So Napoleon decided to use one of his favorite military strategies, bringing all his forces together at the most important spot to get temporary control of the seas. French and Spanish ship groups scattered across many different ports would come together to form one massive combined fleet that could take on the British Navy. The Emperor put Admiral Pierre Villeneuve in charge of the first part of this important mission. Villeneuve had started his Navy career when he was just 14 years old as a trainee officer, and he had served during the American War of Independence. He supported the French Revolution and was one of the very few noble officers who stayed in the Navy during those dangerous times, which led to his promotion to Rear Admiral. In 1798, he commanded the 80-gun ship Guillaume Tell during the Battle of the Nile. His ship was one of the few that managed to escape that terrible defeat. He was later captured when the British took Malta, but they released him when peace was declared between the countries. In 1804, the commander of the French Mediterranean fleet suddenly died of a heart attack, and Villeneuve took his place with the rank of vice admiral. When it came to personality, Villeneuve was nothing like Nelson. In 1805, he wrote a letter to the Navy minister saying, "Please remember that I never asked to command this squadron. What's more, I have always wanted a practical and useful career, not one filled with glory and fame." On March 30th, following the Emperor's direct orders, Admiral Villeneuve sailed from Toulon with 11 warships. He managed to sneak past Nelson's ships that were blocking the port and met up with 6 Spanish ships and another French ship near Cadiz. Commanding 18 ships, Villeneuve began a 5-week journey across the Atlantic Ocean. When he arrived in the French West Indies, he joined forces with 2 more French ships under Rear Admiral Meg, and meanwhile, the British were in complete chaos. When Nelson lost track of Villeneuve's fleet, he guessed the French were heading back to Egypt, so he raced off to catch them there. He reached Alexandria before he realized he had made a terrible mistake. So he turned around and headed for the West Indies, but he was now a full month behind. Nelson made the ocean crossing in just 4 weeks, which was incredibly fast. But he still missed Villeneuve by only a few days, as the French admiral had already sailed back toward Europe on June 8th. Then the British got a lucky break. Nelson sent a fast ship to carry his reports back to England. By pure chance, this ship spotted Villeneuve's fleet in the Atlantic Ocean. Their course wasn't back to the Mediterranean Sea like Nelson had thought, but further north, heading toward the English Channel. Vice Admiral Calder, with 15 warships, was put on high alert to intercept them. On July 22nd, Calder intercepted Villeneuve's fleet off Cape in confused fighting through heavy fog. The British managed to capture 2 Spanish ships, but Calder failed to stop Villeneuve from reaching the Spanish port of The French admiral then made a decision that would change everything. His orders were crystal clear. Go to Brest and then continue to the Channel for the invasion. But reports of enemy ships to the north convinced him that he was about to be attacked by Britain's powerful Channel fleet. His ships had been battered by Atlantic storms and battle damage, and they couldn't fight again without major repairs. So he decided to retreat to Cadiz. Instead, he was soon surrounded by a growing number of British ships. Napoleon was absolutely furious when he received this news.
Villeneuve doesn't have the strength of character to command even a small frigate. He angrily told his naval minister. It was almost autumn now, and a cross-channel invasion was completely impossible. Villeneuve had failed him completely. Napoleon had to look for other ways to defeat the British. In late August, Napoleon's troops packed up their camp at Boulogne and marched off to fight the Austrians and Russians along the Danube River. At the same time, he sent new orders to Admiral Villeneuve to sail into the Mediterranean Sea, where he was supposed to support French military operations in Italy. But his Franco-Spanish combined fleet was in terrible shape. They were short on supplies and men, and they were completely surrounded by a powerful British force now, commanded by Admiral Nelson himself.
Villeneuve decided to stay where he was and not risk a battle. But when Napoleon told him that he was being replaced as commander, the French admiral was finally pushed into action. On October 18, 1805, he ordered the Franco-Spanish fleet to leave port and head out to sea. Admiral Villeneuve's combined fleet was made up of 33 warships, 18 French and 15 Spanish ships. Admiral Villeneuve's command ship was the 80. The Spanish ships were led by Admiral Gravina, sailing on the Príncipe de Asturias, which had 112 guns. Nelson had been waiting for the enemy with 34 warships, but he had just been forced to send 6 ships to Gibraltar for supplies and repairs. Vice Admiral Calder, sailing on HMS Prince of Wales, was sent home to face a military trial for his poor performance at Cape Fin. So Nelson was now slightly outnumbered, 27 ships against 33 enemy vessels, though he did have 3 powerful first-rate ships. His own command ship Victory, the Britannia, and Vice Admiral Collingwood's Royal Sovereign. Both fleets also had several smaller, faster ships for scouting and carrying messages between the larger vessels. On paper, the Royal Navy was heavily outgunned by the enemy, but the British knew they could count on better seamanship and much faster cannon firing to balance out the disadvantage. After 8 weeks stuck in Cadiz, Villeneuve was finally back at sea, but he had given his own captains very little warning about their sudden departure, and he had chosen to sail in light winds that weren't favorable for sailing. As they slowly moved south along the Spanish coast, British scouting ships spotted them. These fast ships quickly carried news of the enemy's departure to Nelson and the British fleet, who were patrolling 40 miles off the coast. Nelson immediately changed course to intercept the enemy fleet. On the morning of October 21st, Villeneuve's fleet was about 10 miles northwest of Cape Trafalgar, heading for the Straits of Gibraltar. When the British fleet was spotted closing in from the northwest, Villeneuve faced a terrible choice. He thought about running for the Mediterranean Sea or facing the British in a direct battle, but in the end, he ordered his entire fleet to turn around and sail back toward Cadiz. This sudden change in direction, combined with the light winds and many inexperienced crews, caused the combined fleet's formation to become extremely messy and disorganized. The fleet now formed a rough crescent shape that stretched over 5 miles of ocean. Both mentally and strategically, Villeneuve's fleet was already at a serious disadvantage before the battle even began. The difference between the two fleets couldn't have been more obvious. Admiral Nelson's sailors were ready to fight. They had been waiting for this moment, and their commander had prepared a daring strategy that would change naval warfare forever. By 11 in the morning, the British ships had arranged themselves in battle formation. They moved toward the enemy fleet, commanded by Villeneuve, though the weak wind made their progress painfully slow. Nelson had spent weeks thinking about this attack. Most naval commanders at the time would simply line up their ships next to the enemy and exchange cannon fire back and forth. This traditional method often ended without a clear winner, which frustrated Nelson greatly. The British admiral had chosen a much bolder approach. He would split his fleet into 2 separate groups that would charge straight at the enemy line. These columns would punch through the French and Spanish formation, breaking it into smaller pieces. Each section could then be surrounded and destroyed before the front ships of the enemy fleet could turn around to help. This plan came with serious risks. During the long approach, the first British ships in each column would face heavy bombardment, while being unable to fire back. Their guns would be pointing the wrong way, leaving them defenseless. Nelson knew this danger well, but he decided to lead one of these vulnerable columns himself aboard his flagship HMS Victory. The second column would be commanded by Vice Admiral Collingwood on HMS Royal Sovereign. As the British fleet began moving forward, Nelson wanted to send an inspiring message to his men. He originally planned to signal to England confides that every man will do his duty. But the signaling system made it easier to say, England expects that every man will do his duty. This famous message would echo through history. The light breeze meant both British columns crawled forward at only 3 knots, barely faster than a person walking on land. The leading ships would have to endure nearly 3/4 of an hour of enemy fire before reaching their targets. This would test the courage of every British sailor. The battle began at noon when the French warship Foucault fired the first shots at Royal Sovereign. Soon, the entire combined fleet of French and Spanish ships was thundering with cannon fire. However, their gun crews lacked proper training, and their ships rolled heavily in the wind because they were positioned sideways to the breeze. Most of their shots flew wide of their targets. Nelson raised another signal on Victory's rear mast. Engage the enemy more closely. This flag would stay there until enemy fire eventually destroyed it. As the distance between the fleets shortened, the French and Spanish gunners began hitting their marks more often. Round cannonballs tore through the sails of both Victory and Royal Sovereign, creating holes everywhere. Wooden beams and masts crashed down onto the decks. Victory's steering wheel was smashed by a direct hit, making the ship harder to control. British casualties began mounting as more shots found their targets. Twice, other British ships tried to move ahead of Victory to shield Nelson from enemy fire, but the admiral ordered them back into their proper positions. Nelson aimed to break through the enemy line right next to Villeneuve's flagship. Attacking the enemy commander directly was part of his ruthless battle strategy. Unfortunately, The French and Spanish ships were not in a neat line, and many lacked the flags that would identify which ship carried which admiral. Nelson had to make his best guess about which vessel held Luckily, his guess proved correct. Around 12:30, HMS Victory was positioned to smash through the enemy line just behind the Bucentaur. However, Collingwood's faster-moving Royal Sovereign would actually break through first, further south in the battle line. The British had kept their cannons silent during the entire approach. They had suffered under enemy fire for 30 minutes with no way to strike back. That was about to change dramatically. Every British gun had been loaded with 2 cannonballs instead of 1, doubling their destructive power. HMS Royal Sovereign passed behind the Spanish ship Santa Ana and unleashed a massive broadside into her unprotected rear. This devastating attack sent cannonballs the entire length of the enemy's ship, causing terrible damage. A few minutes later, HMS Victory sailed behind the Bucentaur and delivered her own crushing broadside. This single attack crippled Villeneuve's flagship and killed or wounded nearly half of her crew. Despite these 2 powerful opening blows, the lead British ships found themselves badly outnumbered and in serious danger. Collingwood's Royal Sovereign came under fire from enemy ships on all sides. The second ship in his column, HMS Bellel, had all her masts shot away, leaving her helpless. HMS Mars was also taking heavy punishment from multiple directions. HMS Victory became entangled with a French ship called Re, which carried many skilled Marines trained for close combat. In the fierce hand-to-hand fighting that followed, the isolated British ships at the front had to hold on desperately until reinforcements could reach them. After 20 dangerous minutes, more British ships began arriving one by one to join the fight. They crashed into the confused enemy formation, firing their double-loaded cannons with devastating results. Victory finally received much-needed help when HMS Temeraire arrived alongside her. As each new British ship entered the battle, a massive brawl developed among all the vessels. This chaotic close-range fighting was exactly what Nelson had wanted. The enemy's ships could not escape and were being pounded at point-blank range. Meanwhile, Admiral Dumanoir's French and Spanish ships at the front of their original line had begun turning around to rejoin the battle. However, their painfully slow maneuver would take more than an hour to complete. HMS Africa, a smaller 64-gun warship, had earlier become separated from the main British fleet. Her captain, Henry Digby, received Nelson's order to withdraw to safety, but chose to interpret it differently. Instead of retreating, he charged straight into the battle from the north. HMS Africa sailed alone past the entire enemy vanguard, exchanging cannon fire with every ship she passed. Then she joined the attack on the massive which carried 136 guns and was one of the largest warships in the world. Victory and Redoubtable were now locked in brutal close-quarters combat. British cannons smashed the French ship's hull into splinters, while Redoutable's crew gathered on deck to board and capture Victory. At this critical moment, HMS Temeraire appeared on Redoutable's other side and swept her deck with grape-shot small metal balls that acted like a giant shotgun. The French boarding party was cut down instantly. All 3 ships became tangled together and drifted into another French vessel. Some French and Spanish ships, like Admiral Me, had used their time in port wisely to train their crews for boarding attacks and close combat. This preparation made them dangerous opponents in hand-to-hand fighting. However, time and again, just as a French or Spanish crew formed up to board a British ship, another British vessel would emerge through the thick smoke of battle. These rescuing ships would sweep the enemy decks with grape shot, killing the boarding parties before they could attack. Superior British gunnery skills were slowly wearing down their opponents. One by one, the first French and Spanish ships began lowering their flags as a sign of surrender. The British were winning through their superior training and aggressive tactics. At the height of the fierce battle, a French marksman positioned high in Redoutable's rigging spotted the British commander on Victory's. Nelson was easy to identify because of his bright military decorations, which he had refused to remove despite advice from his officers. The sniper fired a single musket shot that struck Nelson in the shoulder, before traveling down through his spine. They finally succeeded. Nelson said, "I am dead." His men carried him below deck for medical treatment, where he continued receiving regular updates about how the battle was progressing. To the south, the French warship Aquileia, under attack from several British ships simultaneously, had caught fire. The flames spread quickly through her wooden hull and rigging, creating a spectacular and terrifying sight that could be seen across the entire battlefield. In the northern part of the battle, Dumanoir's advanced ships were finally ready to fight. But something went wrong with their plan. Only one ship called actually tried to attack properly. The rest of the French ships just fired a few shots from far away, then turned around and sailed off instead of getting close to fight the British ships. This made the Spanish sailors so angry that they wanted to shoot at their own French allies. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The French ships quickly moved away from the fighting area. They could tell that their commander Villeneuve's fleet was losing badly. More than 12 French and Spanish ships had already given up and surrendered to the British. Down below on HMS Victory, Admiral Nelson was dying. He lay on the lowest deck of his ship, barely alive. He knew his time was running out. Nelson whispered to his dear friend Captain Hardy, asking him to look after Lady Hamilton, the woman he loved. Then he said those famous words, "Kiss me, Hardy." After a few quiet moments, Nelson spoke his final words, "Thank God I have done my duty." Soon after, the great admiral died. Around 6 in the evening, something terrible happened at the southern end of the battle. The French ship Aquila had been on fire, and the flames finally reached where they stored their gunpowder. The entire ship exploded in a massive blast that killed half the crew instantly. This shocking explosion marked the end of a battle that had killed 5,000 men. By now, everyone could see that the British had won a complete victory. Out of 33 French and Spanish ships that started the fight, 17 had been captured and 1 was completely destroyed. Several British ships were badly damaged, but amazingly, not a single British ship was lost. The number of dead and wounded told the same story. Admiral Villeneuve was captured along with thousands of other prisoners. The British let him return to France, but 6 months later he was found dead. Nobody knows for sure if he killed himself or was murdered. The Spanish commander Admiral Gravina managed to escape from the battle, but he died from his wounds 6 months later. For the British, their amazing victory was spoiled by losing their brilliant leader Nelson. As Nelson lay dying, his last order to the fleet was to drop their anchors, because he was worried about bad weather coming. He was right to be concerned. A terrible Atlantic storm hit soon after the battle ended. The storm battered the winning British fleet and all the ships they had captured. Strong winds howled for days, causing complete chaos. The storm scattered the battle-damaged ships across miles of ocean. The French and Spanish forces saw their chance and tried to take back some of their captured ships. French warships managed to recapture the Spanish ship Santa Ana, for captured crews fought back against their British guards and took control of their own ships again. But 3 of these ships were driven onto the shore and wrecked by the storm. Even though the British worked incredibly hard, they could only save 4 out of the 17 ships they had captured. The rest were either burned or lost in the storm. The terrible weather probably killed more French and Spanish sailors than the actual battle did. The bad news for France kept coming. 2 weeks after the main battle, Admiral Dumanoir and his 4 French ships that had escaped were caught by Captain Strachan, British squadron near Cape. All 4 French ships were captured, making it an incredible 2 weeks of victory for the British Navy. Nelson's body was brought back to England on HMS Victory. They preserved his body in a barrel of brandy and tied it to the main mast of the ship. Nelson became the first person who was unroyal to get a state funeral in Britain since the Duke of Marlborough 83 years earlier. For 3 days, Nelson's body was displayed in the Painted Hall at Greenwich Hospital. Thousands of people came to pay their respects. Then his body was moved by boat along the river to St. Paul's Cathedral. The funeral procession was enormous. It included 32 admirals, 189 carriages, and thousands of soldiers. Nelson's coffin was made from wood taken from a French warship called L'Orient. They placed it in a stone tomb in the cathedral's underground crypt. It took 4 weeks for news of the Battle of Trafalgar to reach Napoleon, who was near Vienna at the time. He was on his way to win his own great victory against the Russians and Austrians at a place called Ost. Both battles happened in the same year, but Trafalgar would have much bigger effects on history. The Battle of Trafalgar was one of the most devastating victories in naval history. The battle didn't actually save Britain from being invaded, because that danger had already passed, but the huge scale of the victory meant that Britain ruled the seas without challenge for the remaining 10 years of the wars against Napoleon. Napoleon had to find other ways to try to defeat the British. This path would lead him to make serious mistakes that would eventually cause his own downfall. For Britain, controlling the seas after Trafalgar gave them the power to build their empire throughout the entire 19th century. This was the age when Britain dominated the world as the leading global empire. The Royal Navy wouldn't face another serious challenge at sea until the Battle of Jutland, more than 100 years later. Right now, many people are wondering whether artificial intelligence is making online videos better or worse. You might have noticed a flood of new documentaries with copied scripts, robotic voices, and completely wrong pictures. At Epic History, we have always used real people and promised to keep using skilled human teams. This ensures everything we create is reliable and authentic. From research to scripts, animation, and narration, real humans do all the work. If you're tired of searching through poor quality AI-made content just to find something worth watching, then maybe it's time to check out Nebula. It's a premium streaming service where you'll only find high-quality videos made by real people. Nebula has hundreds of great creators covering all types of subjects. Whatever you're interested in, you're guaranteed to find something you'll love. They have original movies and entertainment series, plus documentaries about science, technology, travel, true crime, and of course, history. The history section shows just how much Nebula offers, including special Nebula originals that only subscribers can watch. If you like our channel, we're sure you'll also love Real-Time History's amazing collection of military history documentaries. They have recent episodes about Desert Storm, the Vietnam War, and their brand new video called U-Boats Unleashed, the Battle of the Atlantic 1940. Just like our videos, all of theirs are available to Nebula subscribers first, and without any ads. Nebula is a streaming service built by creators to offer a better experience than other video platforms. Right now, it's the most interesting and fastest growing independent video platform on the internet, because Nebula fairly pays its creators. Signing up actively supports channels like ours, as we work hard to create even more ambitious history content. Plus, we have a great discount for Epic History viewers. The link in our video description gets you 40% off Nebula's yearly plan. That's just $36 a year, or $3 a month. Even better, the Nebula Lifetime Plan offers lifetime access with no strings attached for $300. This helps Nebula fund more of its original creator-owned series. Thanks to all our existing Nebula subscribers, and for everyone else watching, we hope to see you there soon. Big thanks to Drake Kineful for expert research and advice throughout our series on Nelson's battles. For anyone interested in naval history, his YouTube channel is essential viewing. It's packed with profiles of historic warships and expert discussion of naval technology and operations. Thank you to Jack Fine Art and the estate of Derek Gardner for permission to use his painting of the battle in this video. You can view more of his fantastic paintings online using the link in the video description. Thanks as always to the Patreon supporters who help make this channel possible. From builders like Trey Tatro, Ellington Total War, and Neil to citizens like Casual Donor, O_M, and Drew, and heroes like William Fowler. Join their ranks by joining us on Patreon, where you'll get early ad-free access to new videos, exclusive updates, and votes on future video topics. The year was 1925. China had been without an emperor for 13 years, yet the nation was still broken and bleeding. Military leaders fought each other across the land, commanding armies that totaled 1.5 million soldiers. In Beijing, the old capital, people wept for Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary hero who had just died. Many had believed he could bring peace and hope to their troubled country. Even though Sun Yat-sen was gone, his dream lived on. He had wanted to crush the military strongmen and bring all of China under one government. Now this mission fell to his follower, a 37-year-old man named Ji. The Western world knew him better as Chiang Kai. Chiang ran the Kuomintang's military school at Whampoa. People saw him as someone who could inspire others, get things done, and reach for power. He had studied war in Japan, where he first met Sun Yat-sen back in 1908. That meeting changed his life and made him join the fight for a new China. When Sun Yat-sen died, military strongmen controlled most of China. These were greedy generals and local bosses who had their own private armies. They cared only about themselves and their own power. They ruled their territories like kings. The Kuomintang, which people also called the Nationalists, only controlled the southern areas, Guangxi and Guangdong provinces. Their main city was Canton. To get stronger, they had made a shaky deal with the Communist Party. Together, they formed what was called the First United Front. This partnership meant they could get help from Soviet Russia. But many Kuomintang members, including Chiang himself, didn't trust the Soviets. Chiang had recently visited Russia and came back convinced that communism would never work in China. Still, people across China were hungry for change. They were tired of the chaos, the fighting warlords, and foreign countries meddling in their affairs. During 1925, workers and people who hated foreign control began rising up. When international police in Shanghai shot at protesters, workers in southern cities went on strike. Both the Kuomintang and the Communist Party gained thousands of new members, but the suspicion between these unlikely partners never went away. In 1926, Chiang decided to act first. He claimed that communists were plotting against him and launched his own surprise attack. He put Canton under military control and had his political enemies arrested or kicked out of the country. This included Soviet advisors. He also threw communists out of the Whampoa Military Academy, including a rising communist star named Zhou Enlai, who was only 28 years old. This bold move made Chiang's control over both the Kuomintang military and the Nationalist Party much stronger. Surprisingly, the Soviets still agreed to keep supporting him militarily because they desperately wanted to keep some influence in China. The First United Front barely survived. Now Chiang was ready to fulfill Sun Yat-sen's final wish, a northern expedition to defeat China's warlords and unite the entire country under Kuomintang rule. The most powerful warlord in northern China was Zhongzhou. He controlled the Beiyang government in Beijing, which other countries still recognize as China's official government. In central China, the main figure was Wu Peifu, known as the Jade Marshal. His partner, Sun Quanfang, ruled several eastern provinces and controlled the important cities of Nanjing and Shanghai. In the south, Chiang commanded the National Revolutionary Army, which had 100,000 soldiers. He knew that when he marched north, his enemies would greatly outnumber his forces. However, his troops were better trained and had modern Soviet weapons. He also had friendly warlords on his side, Li Zongren, Feng Yuxiang, and Yan Shi. Chiang planned to move north step by step, carefully defeating each hostile warlord. In the early months of the war, his northern expedition moved forward quickly. By April, the Kuomintang controlled southern China's most important cities, including Wuhan, Shanghai, and Nanjing. First Wu Peifu fell. Then Sun Quanfang was driven from his strongholds. Only Zhang Zuolin remained in the north. Many warlord soldiers switched sides and joined Chiang's army, making his National Revolutionary Army grow to an enormous force of 700,000 men. Victory in a united China seemed close. As National Revolutionary Army troops marched toward Beijing, old tensions between the Kuomintang and communist factions came back. Chiang Kai-shek grew more suspicious of his Soviet advisors and worried about the communists' growing boldness. His fears seemed proven right as his army approached Shanghai. A few days before they arrived, Zhou Enlai and other communists used a workers' revolt to take control of the city. But Chiang had his own powerful friends in Shanghai. Du Yusheng, nicknamed Begia Du, was a crime boss who ruled Shanghai's underworld. He was also Chiang's personal ally. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1927, Du ordered his Green Gang to attack the communists and union leaders who had taken over the city. Thousands of Shanghai workers poured into the streets to protest. Chiang's Kuomintang soldiers opened fire on them. Over the following days and weeks, about 12,000 communists were killed or disappeared in Shanghai alone. The First United Front had ended in bloodshed and betrayal. This Shanghai massacre was only the beginning. The Kuomintang began hunting down communists everywhere they controlled. The communists fought back by starting uprisings across the country. Zhou Enlai, who barely escaped Shanghai alive, led an armed revolt against Kuomintang rule the next month. Mao Zedong led the Autumn Harvest Uprising in December. A third uprising happened in Canton. All three revolts were quickly crushed by Kuomintang forces. But there was no doubt that a brutal new phase had begun in China's revolutionary struggles. While the communists fought to survive, Chiang's northern expedition continued moving forward. He now targeted the last hostile warlord standing, Zhang Zu, on June 6, 1928. In a moment full of meaning, Kuomintang troops entered Beijing, the old imperial capital. Zhang retreated beyond the Great Wall into Manchuria, a region where Japan had heavy political and economic influence. A large Japanese military force called the Kuomintang Army was stationed there. The Japanese had supported Jiang for several years, but now decided he was no longer useful. As Zhang traveled north by train, his car was destroyed by a massive bomb planted by a Japanese officer. The Japanese military hoped for better results from Jiang's 27-year-old son, Zhang Zu, but the young marshal, as people called him, had his own plans. In July, Zhang Jr. began talks with the Kuomintang. In exchange for promising loyalty to Chiang, he would keep control of his father's old territory in northeast China. Finally, after 10 years of internal fighting, China was unified, with one flag, one capital, and one leader. But it wouldn't be long before he faced his first major rebellion. In 1929, Chiang proposed a major reorganization of the National Revolutionary Army. He wanted to cut its size in half, from around 1.5 million men to 715,000, and split its troops into 65 divisions of 11,000 men each. His generals, many of whom had previously served China's warlords, correctly saw this as an attempt to weaken their power. A group of them formed an anti-Chiang coalition and threw China back into civil war. The Central Plains War, as it became known, pitted Kuomintang forces against their former warlord allies. Around 1 million soldiers took part in the fighting. Chiang Kai-shek suffered several early defeats but eventually regained control, thanks to support from Zhang, the young marshal. Victory came at enormous human and economic cost. After a generation of revolution and war, Chiang Kai-shek had once more proven his military authority over the country. Now he faced the next overwhelming challenge: to transform the Republic of China into a united, prosperous, independent nation. Chiang established his one-party government in Nanjing, a former capital of the Ming dynasty. These years became known as the Nanjing Decade, a period of sustained Kuomintang rule across eastern China at least. In reality, the country's unity was fragile and mostly on paper. Only Nanjing and its surrounding area were under direct Kuomintang control. Most of the country was still governed by warlords who were more or less loyal to Chiang's government. The communists, meanwhile, were wounded but not destroyed, and formed pockets of resistance throughout the country. In power, Chiang Kai-shek, referred to as the Commander-in-Chief or General, became increasingly harsh and controlling. To unite the country around a homegrown alternative to communism, he launched the New Life movement, bringing back Confucian ideas updated for modern times. Chiang's wife, Sung Meiling, who was educated in America and came from a prominent Chinese Christian family, played a leading role. The New Life movement had limited impact, but by the early 1930s, parts of China were rapidly modernizing. New laws promoted equality between men and women and protected women's rights in marriage and property ownership. Education continued to spread. Newspapers, magazines, and journals multiplied. New movie theaters and playhouses opened. Infrastructure projects helped the Chinese economy develop industry. There was also huge foreign investment, especially from Japan. Though people complained about widespread corruption within Chiang's inner circle, yet 85% of China's population were farmers. Their situation had not improved since the time of the Qing dynasty. They remained desperately poor and gained little from developments in cities like Nanjing and Shanghai. The countryside of China was facing a terrible crisis. farmers couldn't grow enough food because their soil was worn out and washing away. Land prices kept going up, making life even harder. The ruling Kuomintang party paid little attention to these struggling rural communities, but the Communist Party saw an opportunity and began spreading their ideas throughout the farming areas. Then disaster struck in 1931. Massive floods swept across central and eastern China, causing unbelievable damage. Between 1 and 4 million people died in what became one of history's worst natural disasters. While China was dealing with all these problems at home, other countries saw a chance to take advantage of the chaos. Japan had been growing its territory for many years by taking land from its neighbors. Now, with growing military power and national pride, some Japanese leaders saw China as their next target. Japan already controlled many businesses, train lines, and mines in northeast China. They wanted to take over all of Manchuria, because it had valuable natural resources that Japan needed. On September 18, 1931, something happened near the city of Mukden that would change everything. An explosion damaged part of a Japanese-owned railway, but this wasn't an accident or an attack by Chinese forces. Japanese military officers had planted the bomb themselves to create an excuse for invasion. Despite protests from China and other countries, Japanese forces launched their attack. In just 3 months they controlled most of northeast China. They pushed back the Chinese forces led by a general nicknamed the Young Marshal. All of China was angry about this invasion, but their leader Chiang Kai-shek refused to start a full war with Japan. He believed in dealing with problems inside China first, then worrying about outside threats later. Chiang's plan was to give up territory temporarily to buy time. He told his generals to retreat rather than fight. Japan then created a fake country in northeast China called Manchuria. They put China's former Emperor Puyi on the throne as their puppet ruler. He was only 26 years old and had no real power. Chiang Kai-shek believed the communists were a bigger threat to his government than the Japanese were. Only about 10,000 communist party members had survived the violent attacks of 1927, but they had rebuilt their strengths in China's rural areas. They formed several small governments in remote countryside regions. The most successful was called the Jiangxi Soviet. The leader of this communist territory was Mao Zedong. His father had been a successful farmer, and Mao was one of the original founders of China's Communist Party. Now he controlled the Jiangxi Soviet, which governed over 3 million people. They had their own banks, money, and tax system. However, other communist leaders criticized Mao for being too harsh in removing his opponents, and he lost some of his influence. Zhou Enlai took over military leadership instead. The Jiangxi Soviet showed what a communist-controlled China might look like. For the Kuomintang government, this was extremely dangerous. Chiang Kai-shek planned several military campaigns to surround and destroy his army faced strong resistance from the Communist Red Army. The first 4 attempts to destroy the communist base all failed. The fighting between these two Chinese groups was incredibly brutal and caused massive suffering. Ordinary people, mostly poor farmers, got caught between two ruthless armies. Both sides carried out mass killings and tortured or shot anyone they suspected of being Even Mao's own wife was killed by Kuomintang forces when she refused to speak against her husband. Nobody knows exactly how many people died during this phase of China's civil war, but it may have been as many as 500,000. Finally, in September 1934, Chiang Kai-shek gathered nearly 1 million soldiers to completely surround and destroy the Jiangxi Soviet. This time, the weakened communists couldn't hold their position. They slowly lost ground until only about 100,000 soldiers and civilians remained in a small area around the city of Rui. The communist leaders made a desperate decision to abandon their base and escape to fight again later. Many died trying to break through the Kuomintang forces surrounding them. The survivors began an incredible journey that lasted a full year. Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong led them across some of China's most dangerous territory. They battled enemy forces, starvation, and exhaustion along the way. Less than 1 in 10 of the original Jiangxi communists completed the 6,000-mile journey to reach Yan'an, where they joined up with other communist groups from around the country. This amazing achievement became a legendary story for the Chinese Communist Party, known as the Long March. Mao's leadership during this difficult time helped him become the undisputed leader of the party, beating out rivals who were supported by the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the Chinese Communist Party would follow Mao's ideas rather than orders from Moscow. For the moment, the communists seemed defeated. They had been badly weakened and were hiding in remote areas, but their situation was about to change dramatically. In December 1936, Chiang Kai-shek traveled to Xi'an in northern China to meet with a young marshal. His forces were leading the fight against the communists in their new northern hideout. 8 years had passed since the young marshal's father was killed by the Japanese. 3 years after that, Japanese forces had driven his army out of Manchuria. The young marshal was furious that Chiang refused to fight the Japanese invaders. He came up with a daring plan. He kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek and forced him to negotiate directly with the Zhou Enlai represented the communist side in these talks. After 2 weeks of intense discussions, Chiang Kai-shek finally agreed to their demands. Chiang promised to stop the civil war and join forces against Japan before he was released. Once he returned safely to the capital city of Nanking, He immediately put the young marshal under house arrest, but he kept his most important promise. Chiang agreed to form an alliance with his communist enemies, creating what was called the Second United Front to fight Japan together. On the evening of July 7, 1937, a small group of Japanese soldiers demanded to enter the walled town of Wamping, near Beijing. They claimed they were looking for a missing soldier. The Chinese guards refused to let them in. Tension built up quickly between the two sides. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out from the Chinese position. Both sides immediately started shooting at each other. This small incident triggered one of the deadliest wars of the 20th century. What started as a minor confrontation would soon engulf all of China and eventually become part of the larger World War II conflict that would reshape the entire world. During the 700s, a powerful new family took control of one of history's most impressive empires. The Abbasid dynasty ruled the Islamic world for 500 years. Under their leadership, Muslim armies dominated battlefields, magnificent cities rose from the desert, scholars made incredible discoveries, and inventors created amazing new technologies. This period became known as the Golden Age of Islam. Let's explore how the Abbasids built their empire and changed the world. Our story begins in 632 when the Prophet Muhammad died in the Arabian city of Medina. His followers, united by the new faith of Islam, quickly spread across Arabia under Abu Bakr, the first caliph or religious leader. Then something extraordinary happened. These Muslim armies challenged the two greatest powers of their time, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Sassanid Empire. Both superpowers had weakened themselves through years of warfare. The Muslim forces won battle after battle in a series of stunning victories. By 651, they had conquered most of the Persian lands and taken over two-thirds of the Eastern Roman territories. But success brought new problems. In 656, the third Caliph Uthman was murdered. This sparked the first civil war among Muslims. Ali, who was both the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, had popular support. However, he faced opposition from Muawiyah, the governor of Syria and Uthman's relative. After 5 years of bloody fighting, Ali was killed in the city of Kufa. Muawiyah won and started the Umayyad dynasty. Under their rule, the Islamic Empire grew even larger, becoming one of the biggest empires ever seen. More conflicts followed. Hussein, Ali's son and the Prophet's grandson, challenged the new Umayyad ruler Yazid. Hussein and his supporters were defeated and killed at the Battle of Karbala. Those who supported Ali's family later became known as Shiites, and they still remember Hussein's death every year during the Day of Ashura. The Umayyad Empire kept expanding, but serious problems were growing inside. Most of what we know about the Umayyads comes from their enemies' writings, so we must be careful about believing everything. However, it seems clear that the small group of Arab Muslims who ruled this vast empire were becoming unpopular with their subjects. Non-Muslims, including Christians, Jews, and so were treated as second-class citizens and forced to pay extra taxes. Even people who converted to Islam called Mawali often faced discrimination. Years of unhappiness were about to explode. The Umayyads flew white banners as their symbol of power, but in 747, new black banners appeared to challenge them. These belonged to the Abbasids, an Arab family descended from Al-Abbas, the Prophet Muhammad's uncle. The Abbasids believed their family connection to the Prophet gave them the right to rule. They claimed the Umayyads were corrupt and hated by the people. The Abbasids promised to bring back true Islamic values, proper religious teaching, and moral leadership. They sent messengers throughout the empire to spread their message. In 747, while the empire was torn apart by rebellion and civil war, the Abbasids saw their chance. In the eastern region of Khorasan, a general named Abu Muslim started a revolt. He was probably a Persian convert to Islam, and he adopted the black banner as his symbol. This frontier area, covering parts of modern Iran, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan, was perfect for rebellion. Arabs and non-Arab converts lived together, married each other, and fought side by side to defend the borders. Many saw the Umayyads as distant, unpopular rulers. For decades, Abbasid agents and missionaries had been working to turn people against the Umayyads. They had planted the seeds of revolution. When Abu Muslim began his revolt, he quickly attracted followers: Arabs, Persians, and Central Asians. Many of them experienced warriors. Abu Muslim proved to be a brilliant military commander. He won victory after victory against Umayyad forces and captured Kufa, the capital of Iraq, in 749. The Abbasids took control of this revolution, and the following year, their army faced the Umayyad Caliph Marwan II at the Zab River. Most of our information about this crucial battle comes from Abbasid sources. Caliph Marwan seems to have been brave but reckless, launching a direct cavalry attack against the Abbasid battle line. According to Abbasid historians, their troops, inspired by recent victories, held firm. Their spear formations stopped the cavalry charge, turning the attack into a disaster. The Umayyad army's spirit was broken and they fled the battlefield. Marwan escaped but was later hunted down and killed in Egypt. Other Umayyad family members were tracked down and eliminated. Even their graves were destroyed. Only one family member, Abd al-Rahman, managed to escape to Spain. A few years later, Abd al-Rahman established the Emirate of Cordoba. creating a second Umayyad dynasty that would thrive in Spain for centuries. Meanwhile, Abi al-Abbas al-Safa became the first Abbasid Caliph, though it took more than 10 years for the Abbasids to fully secure their power. Al-Safa moved the Caliph's residence from Haran to Kufa, closer to the Abbasid power base in Persia. In 751, he sent an army to stop the Chinese 10th dynasty from expanding westward. This campaign ended with a bloody victory at the Battle of Talas, but it also marked the furthest point of the Caliphate's eastern expansion. Many people who had helped overthrow the Umayyads wanted to end hereditary rule and return to choosing caliphs from among qualified leaders. They were disappointed. In 754, al-Safa died and was replaced by his brother Al. The Abbasids had become the new ruling family, and al-Mansur would become one of their greatest leaders. However, his reign started badly with the execution of Abu Muslim, the brilliant and popular general who was now seen as a dangerous rival. Al-Mansur also faced rebellion from the Alids, a powerful clan descended from the prophets. They resented the Abbasids' growing power and claimed they should rule instead. Al-Mansur crushed the last major Alid revolt in 762, bringing in an era of stability, prosperity, and peace. That same year, he ordered the construction of a new capital city on the banks of the Tigris River, officially called Madinat as-Salam, meaning City of Peace. It would become his greatest achievement. The world would know this city as Baghdad. During the reign of Al-Mansur's grandson Harun al-Rashid, the Caliphate reached its golden age with Baghdad at its center. Many legends surround Caliph Harun al-Rashid, whose name means the rightly guided. He appears as a central character in the famous collection of Arabic stories, 1001 Nights. According to these stories, al-Rashid was a devout, wise, and kind ruler who prayed 100 times each day and gave away 1,000 silver coins to charity every morning. Legend says he disguised himself as a beggar to walk the streets of Baghdad and see how ordinary people lived. He was described as an excellent horseman, a supporter of the arts, and a skilled chess player. His court was a place where people could openly discuss religion and philosophy. Even women sometimes joined these debates. In the medieval world, few women held high positions in their own right, but as mothers, wives, and companions, they could have great influence. Al-Khazuran, once a slave girl from Yemen, rose from being a companion to becoming a caliph's wife. She wielded significant power during the reigns of her husband Caliph al-Mahdi and her son Caliph al-Rashid. Famous for her intelligence and learning, she participated in discussions about policy and military strategy, met with foreign ambassadors, and intervened in matters of justice. She spent much of her enormous wealth on public projects and charity. Many people compared her to a Kurla or even called her the real caliph. The success of al-Rashid's reign was built on efficient government and administration. Much of their system was based on their predecessors, and they extensively used Persian and Central Asian administrators. Particularly important was the Barmakid family. The Barmakids were descended from high priests of a Buddhist temple near Balkh in modern Afghanistan. As early Abbasid allies, they played a crucial role in government, helping to create an age of Islamic leadership that combined elements of Persian culture. They served the Abbasids faithfully for 3 generations, but court politics could be dangerous and unpredictable. In 803, al-Rashid decided the Barmakids had become too powerful. The family experienced a sudden and dramatic fall from grace, with many members imprisoned or executed. Their downfall ended Barmakid control of the position of vizier, a role that had recently emerged at court as the caliph's senior advisor and chief minister. This was a position of enormous importance. Some viziers would later become so powerful they overshadowed the caliph himself. The fame of al-Rashid's court spread throughout the known world. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful ruler in Europe, sent several diplomatic missions to Baghdad. In return, al-Rashid sent him amazing gifts, including perfume, ivory chess sets, a wonderful water clock, and even an elephant named Abel. The elephant lived for several years at Charlemagne's court in Aachen. This exchange between the Islamic and Christian worlds shows how the Abbasid Caliphate had become a center of power, culture, and learning that commanded respect across continents. The golden age they created would influence science, philosophy, art, and literature for centuries to come. Life in the Islamic Empire was incredibly diverse, especially in Baghdad. The rulers were so welcoming that they even celebrated Persian festivals like Nowruz, the Persian spring celebration. This acceptance of different cultures helped to make the empire an amazing place for learning, art, healing, and discovery. The most famous center of knowledge was an incredible library called the House of Wisdom. Though we don't know much about how it worked today, throughout the empire, smart people worked hard to translate important books from Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit into Arabic. Thanks to their hard work, many valuable writings that might have disappeared forever were saved. This included works by famous thinkers like Aristotle and Galen. These scholars also made their own groundbreaking discoveries that European countries would later desperately want to learn about. Baghdad's thinkers were the best in the world at many subjects. Al-Kindi earned the nickname the Arab philosopher because he was brilliant at so many things. He wrote about thinking, the mind, stars, and much more. Al-Khwarizmi was so good at math that people called him the father of algebra. When Europeans tried to say his name, they said algorithmus, which is where we get our word algorithm today. A Christian scholar named Hunayn ibn Ishaq became known as the master translator because he was so skilled at turning ancient texts into Arabic. Art and crafts also grew beautifully during this time. In the 800s, they started making shiny pottery that opened up new ways to create beautiful things. Archaeologists have found colorful pieces decorated with animals and fancy Arabic writing all across the old empire. The empire also benefited greatly from sitting right in the middle of the Silk Road, the ancient network of trading paths that connected Europe and Asia. Expensive goods traveled along these routes, including silk, spices, ivory, precious stones, and even prize horses. To help this trade grow, the rulers built new roads and set up rest stops, hospitals, and water sources for travelers. New ideas and inventions also moved along these trade routes. The Chinese art of making paper had reached the Muslim world earlier, but it really took off under Abbasid rule. Paper was much cheaper than animal skins or papyrus, so having lots of it completely changed how governments worked and how books were made. This helped medieval Islamic society become one of the most book-loving cultures in all of history. Back in the 600s, Arab armies had pushed the Eastern Roman Empire back to the Taurus Mountains. Since then, these two powers had been fighting almost constantly, with both sides regularly attacking each other across the Syrian border. The Arabs had even tried to capture Constantinople twice, but couldn't take the great city. In 782, al-Rashid personally led an army all the way to the shores of the Bosphorus. By 804, the Eastern Roman Empire was paying money every year to avoid being attacked. When Emperor Nikephoros stopped these payments, an Arab army crossed the mountains and surprised his forces at The Romans lost badly, and the emperor barely escaped alive. The cycle of attacks continued for years, with al-Rashid even moving his capital to Raqqa to be closer to the fighting. But focusing so much on his western enemy may have made him miss growing problems in the east. In 809, word came of a rebellion in Khorasan. While traveling east to deal with this uprising, Caliph Harun al-Rashid got sick and died. His 22 years of rule would be remembered as the golden time of the Abbasid Empire, a period of wealth, peace, smart thinking, and cultural success. However, al-Rashid's own plans to ensure a smooth transition of power were about to go terribly wrong and throw the empire back into civil war. The empire had done wonderfully under Caliph Harun al-Rashid's leadership. To keep the success going, he set up his succession in a way he thought would bring stability and peace. His son Muhammad was supposed to be his replacement, but following a common practice from earlier times, he also named another son, Abdullah, as Muhammad's successor. This turned out to be a recipe for disaster. In 809, in Baghdad, Muhammad took over from his father as caliph, calling himself al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy. His half-brother Abdullah became governor of Khorasan and took the title al-Men, meaning the trusted one. Competing groups quickly formed around both brothers. In Baghdad, al-Amin's advisors pushed him to remove his brother from the line of succession. Just 1 year into his rule, he threw out his father's arrangement. Al-Men was furious, and brotherly distrust exploded into civil war. Al-Amin's forces from Khorasan won a huge victory against a much bigger army at Ray, and then marched to surround Baghdad in 8. The city fell. Caliph al-Amin was caught trying to escape and was killed. At first, Al-Men ruled the empire from his old headquarters at Merv. Trying to gain more support after the civil war, he created a new partnership with the elites. This powerful family came from Ali, the fourth caliph and son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad. They would later become leaders of Shia Islam, the branch that believes true religious authority belongs to Ali's descendant. Instead of the traditional Abbasid black clothing, Al-Men's court started wearing green, a color connected to the Alids. Al-Men even married 2 of his daughters to Alidman and made an Alid religious leader his chosen successor. But these policies made people angry back in Iraq and led to major uprisings in Baghdad. After 6 years, the caliph moved the capital back there to restore order and gave up his Alid partnership. Al-Men is also remembered for trying to force a new religious teaching on the empire. He first brought respected scholars to Baghdad to discuss religious questions, like the actions of the Prophet's companions, religious stories, and the nature of the Quran. When he declared that the Quran was created by God at some point in time, rather than existing forever alongside God, he faced fierce opposition. 18 years of religious persecution followed, known as the Mina or Inquisition, during which disagreeing scholars were imprisoned or even executed. In 833, Al-Mun was replaced by his brother, who called himself Al-Mun. He was far more interested in warfare than religious debates. The armies of the Abbasid Empire were famous in battle and included both Arab and non-Arab soldiers. The Khorasanese troops from the border province of Khorasan were the soldiers who had helped bring the Abbasids to power during the Third Islamic Civil War. Drawing on Persian and steppe warrior traditions, their ranks included both armored foot soldiers and heavy armored cavalry. Similar to European knights, the descendants of Khorasanis who settled near Baghdad were called sons of the people of Khorasan. Famous as elite and versatile foot soldiers, they formed the loyal heart of the caliph's army. Other important groups included the Daylamis, expert light fighters from the mountains of northern Persia, African troops, including military slaves and Muslim converts from Ethiopia, fought as heavy infantry with shields, swords, and spears. The great Caliph Harun al-Rashid was known to have an elite bodyguard of 40 African soldiers. Abbasid armies were especially good at attacking cities and expertly used catapults, stone throwers, and battering rams. They even had special troops armed with naphtha or oil-based fire weapons. No pictures from that time survive, but they probably looked similar to this slightly later Byzantine illustration. The 800s, however, would see changes so dramatic that some historians call it a military revolution. During the civil war between Rashid's sons, Al-Mutasim had started expanding his personal army by buying Turkish slave soldiers. His favorite supplier was the Samanid family, governors of These slave soldiers were taken from their villages as boys aboard in slave markets, then sent for intense military training along with Islamic education. They became incredible horsemen and amazingly skilled mounted archers. Al-Jahiz, a writer from that time, described them with wonder. The Turks are as good as anyone with spears, but even better if 1,000 of their horsemen are in trouble. They can all shoot their arrows at once and kill 1,000 enemy horsemen. No group of men can survive such an attack. Historians argue about the exact timing, but sometime in the 8th, these Turkish slave soldiers, called Mamluks, had become an elite unit within the Abbasid army. They were personally loyal to the Caliph and could be used to intimidate his political enemies. Turkish officers, despite starting as outsiders who didn't speak Arabic or understand local customs, began to have huge influence at the Caliph's court. This upset the old nobility, many of whom also stopped getting their traditional military payments. The unhappiness even caused some soldiers to riot in Baghdad's streets. To reduce tension, Al-Mutasim built a new city for the Turkish military elite called Sa. This is where he housed the Turks and rewarded their commanders with land. In the year 848, construction started on what would become the world's biggest mosque, complete with its iconic spiral tower that still stands today. But this grand building project couldn't hide the growing problems within the empire. Al-Mutasim had made a dangerous choice by depending on foreign slave warriors to keep his throne secure. This decision broke apart military traditions that had lasted for hundreds of years and planted the seeds for future chaos. Just 2 years after the mosque construction began, the Caliph took his powerful new army to fight their ancient enemy, the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire. The military campaign was a huge success. They captured and destroyed the important city of Amur. An Arab poet named Abu Tamam celebrated this victory, writing that their hopes had returned overflowing with sweet milk like honey. But even such impressive victories could uncalm the growing tension between the Turkish officers and the Arab nobles who had served the Abbasid family for generations. Some nobles grew so frustrated that they secretly planned to remove Al-Mutasim from power and kick out all the Turkish soldiers. Their plot was discovered, and the conspirators were put to death. When Al-Mutasim died, his oldest son, Al-Wathiq, took over. After Al-Wathiq's sudden death, another son named Al-Mutawakkil became the new ruler. With full support from the Turkish generals, the Turkish leaders thought they could easily control the new caliph like a puppet. They were wrong. Al-Mutawakkil decided it was time to take back real control of his empire. He ordered the murder of several Turkish commanders and tried to balance their power by using Arab and Armenian soldiers instead. The Turks fought back hard. In 861, the caliph's own bodyguards killed him. What happened next was a period of complete chaos that historians call the Decade of Anarchy. 4 different caliphs tried to rule during this time, but each one was just a puppet controlled by the Turkish military leaders. One by one, they were all violently removed from power. Peace only returned when Caliph Al-Mu'tamid took the throne in 870. But the years of chaos had permanently damaged the caliph's authority and respect. Even before the Abbasid family came to power, their massive empire had struggled to control all its different regions. The caliph's authority west of Egypt had always been more of an idea than reality. Now, major rebellions broke out everywhere as local governors and military commanders decided to rule their own territories. Egypt, with its rich farmland and wealth, was one of the first areas to be lost. A rebel Turkish commander took control and started his own ruling family called the Tulunid dynasty. In southern Iraq, a massive revolt began among agricultural slaves who had been brought from eastern Africa. These workers, known as the Zanj, fought for 14 years. Their uprising destroyed much of the region and severely cut off tax money and food supplies to Baghdad. In Afghanistan, a metal worker named Yaqub al-Safar made an incredible rise to power. He founded his own dynasty called the Saffarids and conquered large parts of eastern Persia. His advance was only stopped at the Battle of Deir al-Akwil in 876. During these troubled times, the Abbasid caliphs found it nearly impossible to maintain their authority. But there were some bright spots. Caliph Al-Mu'tamid had managed to bring back some Abbasid strength through smart military campaigns and clever diplomacy. His most successful move was marrying the daughter of the Tulunid ruler who controlled Egypt. His bride was the famous Kader al-Nada, whose name means dewdrop. One scholar described her as one of the most intelligent and royal women who ever lived. When al-Mu'tayyid told his new wife, "You've done well for yourself by marrying the Caliph. What more could you ask God for?" she cleverly replied, "You've done well for yourself too. This marriage makes my father your subject. What more could you ask God for?" Her bold response showed both her strong character and the delicate new balance of power between the Abbasid caliphs and their more powerful subjects. During the rule of al-Mu'tayyid's son al-Muqtafi, Egypt was fully brought back under Abbasid control, but in other places the news was terrible. Abbasid authority completely collapsed in Arabia. One Shiite group called the Qarmatians even began attacking religious pilgrims traveling to the holy city of Mecca. In 930, they committed an unthinkable act by stealing the black stone from the Kaaba. This sacred object was considered the holiest of holy relics, and its theft was a devastating blow to Abbasid prestige and religious authority. In Central Asia, the Persian Samanids carved out their own empire and declared independence from the Kaaba. This period is known as the Persian Intermezzo, when native Persian ruling families controlled Persia once again, after centuries of Arab rule. More and more, people said the Abbasid Caliph could reign but not actually rule. He had become just a symbol without real power, often controlled by his chief minister, called a vizier. By the 930s, the Caliph had lost control of both the government administration and the army. Military command was given to a new official called the Emir al-Umara, which means commander of the commanders. The final humiliation came in 945. The Abids were Shiite warlords from the Dayl Mountains in northwestern Persia. They first succeeded in Fars province, then went on to seize control of Persia and Iraq. When they marched triumphantly into Baghdad, it was a deep embarrassment for the Sunni Abbasids. Yet the Abbasids kept their title of Caliph, even though they were now just figureheads under Abbasid command. They could only watch as spectators during these turbulent times. 20 years later, another Shiite dynasty called the Fatimids swept along the North African coast, conquered Egypt, and founded Cairo as the capital of their own competing caliphate. Some historians call this period the Shiite century, because Shiite dynasties ruled to different caliphates and dominated much of the Muslim world. But this Shiite dominance wouldn't last long. A dangerous new Sunni power was about to explode out of Central Asia: the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks were nomadic herders from the Central Asian steppes. They were fierce warriors who became strong supporters of Sunni Islam. At the end of the 10th century, possibly because of climate changes, they swept south into the region of The Ghaznavid Empire, which had replaced the Samanids, was the first to fall to their advance. The Seljuk Turks seemed They surged westward across the Persian plateau, captured Baghdad and overthrew the Abids. They crushed the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert and forged what became known as the Great Seljuk Empire. Their triumph was challenged by the arrival of European crusaders, who captured Jerusalem in 1099 and established a series of crusader states in the Holy Land. One mysterious Shia sect struck back at the Seljuks with deadly precision. In 1092, Nizam al-Mulk, the chief minister of the Seljuk Empire, was killed by the order of assassins. The hit squad disguised themselves as Sufi mystics to get close to their target. The assassins, known in Arabic as the were a new Ismaili military order based in the mountains of northwestern Persia. Since they faced powerful enemies but had no regular army of their own, they turned to secret operations and targeted killings to achieve their goals. Many wild stories are told about the assassins, but the organization was real and feared throughout the region. They were responsible for dozens of political murders over the next 2 centuries. Under Seljuk rule, Abbasid caliphs continued to serve as spiritual leaders and ceremonial figures, but they had no real political power. The 12th century saw the Great Seljuk Empire fall apart, a familiar story of disputed successions and local governors making their own bids for power. Sensing this weakness, in 1136, Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtafi raised his own army to reassert Abbasid independence for the first time in nearly 2 centuries. He took control of Baghdad and in 1157 successfully defended it against the Seljuk siege. After generations of foreign control, the Abbasids had emerged once again as an independent power, but this resurgence would soon come crashing down. In the 13th century, a new force from the east tore through the Islamic world, scattering armies and destroying every city that refused to surrender to them. The Mongols had arrived. The first to fall was the Khwarezmian Empire, successor to the Seljuks, which was overrun by the Mongol armies of Chinggis Khan. By 1256, his grandson Hulagu was ready to continue the assault. But first, he turned his attention to the assassins, who were rumored to be plotting his death. The secretive order was scattered and completely destroyed. 2 years later, Hulagu advanced against the Abbasid Caliphate itself. As his armies approached Baghdad, he sent a harsh warning to Caliph al-Mustasim, demanding the city's surrender. Despite the Mongols' terrifying reputation for destroying any city that opposed them, al-Mustasim believed Baghdad's walls could keep out these steppe nomads. He was tragically wrong. After half of Baghdad's garrison was massacred in a disastrous attack, the city surrendered, but Hulagu was in no mood for mercy. A contemporary writer described the horrors that followed. The people of Baghdad were put to the sword and subjected to 40 days of killing, looting, and enslavement. They tortured people to steal their wealth. They killed men, women, and children. A large part of the city, including the Caliph's mosque, was burned, and the city was left in ruins. The dead lay like hills in the streets and markets. The death toll is unknown, but was certainly in the tens of thousands. Reportedly, only Christians were spared, thanks to the intervention of Hulag's Christian wife. Baghdad's libraries were destroyed. Their books and manuscripts representing centuries of Muslim learning and scholarship were thrown into the Tigris River. It was said that the river ran black with ink from all the destroyed texts. Al-Mustasim was forced to watch this terrible destruction of his city. Then, according to several historical sources, he was rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death, as the Mongols believed it was unlucky to spill royal blood directly. The last caliph of Baghdad was dead. Never again would the Abbasids hold meaningful political power. Al-Mustasim was technically the last Abbasid Caliph. The family line would continue under the Mamluk Sultanate that now ruled Egypt. But his successors in Cairo were merely ceremonial figures, religious leaders with little actual power. The final caliph, Al-Mutawakkil III, surrendered to the Ottoman Empire in 1517 and was taken as a prisoner to It was a humiliating end for a dynasty that had once ruled one of history's greatest empires. This was the same empire that had dominated the Middle East for centuries, the same empire that had fought and defeated the Byzantines in the West and the Chinese in the East, the same empire that had overseen a great flowering of learning, culture, technology, and trade, the same empire that had reigned over the era remembered as Islam's golden age. For centuries to come, Islamic leaders would claim legitimacy by stating they were descended from this one towering dynasty. Their legacy lived on long after their political power had ended, a testament to the incredible impact they had on the world during their golden era of rule. On July 14, 1789, angry crowds attacked the Bastille fortress in Paris. This massive stone prison had become a hated symbol of the king's harsh rule over France. For years, ordinary people had endured crushing taxes, forced work, and now they were starving. Meanwhile, King Louis XVI and the wealthy nobles lived in incredible luxury, completely ignoring the suffering of their people. The common folk had finally reached their breaking point. Just days before the attack on the Bastille, representatives from across France had gathered and made a famous promise called the Tennis Court Oath. They swore they would limit the king's power and create a new constitution that would protect everyone's rights. A powerful new idea was spreading across France, that all people deserved basic rights and freedoms. This wasn't just about France anymore. These revolutionary ideas were starting to influence people all across Europe. It was the beginning of a time that would bring both hope and chaos, enlightenment and bloodshed. During the early months of the revolution, people were filled with excitement and optimism about the future. After the Tennis Court Oath, France was now governed by something completely new, the National Assembly. This was a group of elected officials, mostly educated middle-class men who believed in the power of reason and progress. The Assembly faced an enormous challenge. They had to write a completely new constitution for France, while also running the country's daily affairs and dealing with a financial crisis that was getting worse every day. Most of these representatives initially thought they could work with the king in a system where he would still be monarch, but with limited powers. However, King Louis XVI and his supporters were absolutely disgusted by this idea. They had no interest whatsoever in sharing any power with ordinary citizens, whom they looked down upon. The king and his allies were determined to restore his complete authority over France. In June 1791, the king made a decision that would change everything. He secretly tried to escape France with his family, hoping to reach the border where loyal forces could help him regain full control. But his plan failed miserably when he was recognized and captured in the town of Valmy. The royal family was brought back to Paris under heavy guard, treated more like prisoners than royalty. This attempted escape felt like a massive betrayal to the French people. It created a deep split among the revolutionaries. Some still believed they could work with a king in a constitutional monarchy, while others now wanted to get rid of the monarchy entirely and create a republic. By September 1791, the assembly managed to agree on a new constitution. Under this system, the king would keep some important powers and would work with a new governing body called the Legislative Assembly. But this new government was plagued by constant disagreements and couldn't get much done. The Legislative Assembly was divided into opposing groups. On one side sat the radical Jacobin who wanted dramatic changes to how taxes were collected, how laws were made, and how the church operated. On the other side were the conservative Feuillants who thought the revolution had already gone too far and should stop. With France's government paralyzed by these political fights, both sides began to see war as a possible solution. They thought that fighting a common enemy might unite the country and help them achieve their goals. Interestingly, in 1792, most of Europe wasn't really worried about France and its revolution. Their main concern was what was happening to Poland. The once powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been getting weaker for decades. In 1772, three neighboring empires, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, had already carved up parts of Polish territory among themselves. Now, In the summer of 1792, Empress Catherine of Russia was worried that Poland might be getting stronger again, so she sent her armies to invade Polish lands. Austria and Prussia watched carefully, determined to grab their own pieces if Russia was going to expand at Poland's expense, while Poland was the main focus. Europe's other monarchs couldn't completely ignore what was happening to King Louis XVI in France. They were concerned about the principles involved and worried that revolutionary ideas might spread to their own countries like a dangerous disease. In 1791, Austria and Prussia had issued a joint statement called the Declaration of Peace. They announced that the treatment of the French king was a concern for all European men. This vague warning was meant to help strengthen King Louis's position, but it had the opposite effect in France. French revolutionaries were outraged by this statement. They saw Austria as a backwards reactionary power that was helping dangerous French exiles. These exiles were mostly aristocrats who had fled France and were now gathering in the German city of Kopp. They were led by the king's own brothers and cousins, and had built up a small army of about 4,000 to 5,000 men, hoping to invade France and undo the revolution. Calls for war began growing louder from all different political groups in France. Among the radical Jacobins, a faction called the Girondins believed that war would bring the country together. Some even talked about launching a crusade to spread revolutionary ideas across all of Europe. Surprisingly, the king and his supporters also wanted war, but for completely different reasons. They thought that fighting would remind French people of their traditional loyalty to the monarchy. Secretly, King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette actually hoped France would lose the war, because defeat would mean the end of the revolution and a return to the old system. On April 20th, 1792, the French Legislative Assembly voted to declare war on the Austrian Empire. The Assembly cited numerous provocations and insults as justification for this momentous decision. France was swept up in war excitement, and most people expected a quick and easy victory. However, the French army, which had once been one of Europe's most powerful military forces, was now in complete disarray because of the revolution. Nearly half of the army's officers had been aristocrats, and most of them had fled the country to escape the revolution. The officers who stayed behind were not trusted by their soldiers or by the politicians back in Paris. The old royal regiments were also viewed with suspicion by the revolutionary government. To make up for these losses, tens of thousands of enthusiastic volunteers had joined the army. This new citizen army was full of passion and patriotic spirit, but they lacked proper training, discipline, and equipment. They were eager to fight but had no idea how to do it effectively. France's war plan was to capture the Austrian Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium. This wealthy province seemed like an easy target that would provide both strategic advantage and economic benefits. 3 experienced generals, Rochambeau, Lafayette, and Luckner, were put in charge of 3 different armies along the frontier. However, these commanders couldn't agree on a coordinated strategy, which doomed their efforts from the start. The weakness of France's new volunteer soldiers became apparent almost immediately. General Byron led an advance toward Brussels and managed to win a small battle, but he was so alarmed by how poorly his troops behaved during and after the fight that he decided to retreat back to the French border. His soldiers were so nervous and inexperienced that when rumors spread of an Austrian counterattack, they completely panicked and fled in all directions. It was a humiliating rout that showed just how unprepared the French army really was. Another French column, commanded by General Dillon, suffered an even worse fate. Rumors spread among the soldiers that their own officers were betraying them to the enemy. In their fear and confusion, the troops turned on General Dillon himself. They shot and stabbed him with bayonets, then threw his body onto a fire. This tragic incident showed how the revolution had created deep mistrust within the French military. Soldiers suspected their commanders of treachery, while officers couldn't control their men. The early military campaigns of the French Revolution were disasters that revealed just how much the political upheaval had damaged France's ability to defend itself. The revolution that had begun with such hope and enthusiasm was now facing its first real test on the battlefield. The outcome of these early battles would determine not just the fate of revolutionary France, but the future of all Europe. Dreams of a swift French triumph crumbled to dust. The summer brought devastating news as Prussia entered the conflict, standing shoulder to shoulder with Austria in what history would remember as the First Coalition. Their mission was crystal clear: march into France, destroy the revolution completely, and put the king back in his rightful place of power. The Prussian forces marched under the command of the Duke of Brunswick, a man widely recognized as Europe's most skilled military leader. On the 25th day of July, he made a chilling announcement. Should any member of the French royal family suffer harm, he promised to unleash unforgettable revenge upon the citizens of Paris. His words carried a terrifying threat: complete destruction of the city and the execution of every single rebel. Just 6 days after this warning, Brunswick's army crossed the Rhine River and began their march deep into French territory. The capital erupted in fury. Citizens were outraged by Brunswick's threatening words, and the National Guard launched a violent assault on the king's residence at the Tuileries Palace on the 10th of August. Swiss guards and royal servants were brutally killed in the attack. Though the royal family managed to escape death by seeking protection with the legislative assembly, they had essentially become prisoners of the radical Jac. The French military was falling apart at the seams. The government couldn't maintain control, and enemy forces were steadily approaching the capital. The revolution faced its darkest hour. The failed attempt to invade the Austrian Netherlands had exposed a harsh reality. France's newly formed citizen army simply was unready for serious warfare. These volunteer soldiers lacked both proper training and the iron discipline that had made the old royal battalions so effective. Recognizing this crisis, French military leaders began implementing sweeping changes at breakneck speed. They simplified battle formations and tactics to match the limited abilities of their new recruits, who kept pouring in from rural areas across the country. Heavy supply wagons and camping equipment were abandoned to make the army more mobile and agile. Most importantly, experienced veterans from the disbanded Royal Army, who had previously been viewed with deep suspicion, were welcomed back into active service. This newly transformed force would prove far more capable in battle, though it still suffered from a severe shortage of experienced officers. At this critical moment, France could only field 54,000 troops under the leadership of Lafayette and Luc to stand between Brunswick's advancing army and Paris. The combined Austrian and Prussian forces numbered 84,000 men. While this might seem like a relatively modest invasion force, military experts believed it would be more than enough to sweep aside France's inexperienced defenders. The careful and methodical Brunswick moved his army slowly through French territory. On the 23rd of August, his forces successfully captured the border stronghold of Long. 10 days later, they seized the fortress city of Verdun. When news of Verdun's fall reached the capital, it triggered widespread panic among the population. Georges Danton, one of the most prominent Jacobin leaders, delivered a fiery speech to rally the people. "Until now, you have only witnessed pretend warfare," he declared. "We are about to face a much more terrible conflict. A war where the entire nation fights against tyrants. The time has come to tell our people they must throw themselves against their enemies with everything they have." These inflammatory words sparked dangerous rumors about secret plots within Paris itself. Angry mobs decided to take matters into their own hands, storming the city's prisons and brutally murdering everyone they found inside. Catholic priests and nuns who had refused to pledge loyalty to the new revolutionary government also became targets of this violence. The September massacres, as they came to be known, claimed the lives of more than 1,000 people. The situation at the front lines was equally chaotic. General Rochambeau had resigned in complete disgrace. Lafayette had committed the ultimate betrayal by defecting to the Austrian side after his disastrous attempt to stage his own military coup against the revolutionary government. The new military commanders were Generals Kellerman and Dumouriez, both passionate supporters of the revolution, but neither had been tested in major combat leadership roles. Dumouriez, known for his energy and bold decision-making, received orders to stop the coalition's advance at the Argonne Forest. However, believing the enemy would march southward, he failed to properly defend the mountain passes, allowing Brunswick to outmaneuver his forces from the north. In a humiliating defeat, Chazot's entire division was scattered by just 1,500 Prussian cavalry soldiers. The panic that followed this rout nearly caused the complete collapse of the entire French army. Dumouriez barely managed to keep his remaining forces from falling apart completely. With this victory, Brunswick had opened a clear path to Paris. But just when things looked hopeless, Kellerman's reinforcements finally arrived to support Dumouriez. His army of the center included some of the finest regiments in the entire French military, giving Dumouriez the confidence he needed to take the fight directly to the enemy. Instead of simply blocking the road to Paris, as expected, Dumouriez made an incredibly bold strategic decision. He marched his army against the rear of the coalition forces, directly threatening their supply lines and communication routes. Unwilling to risk continuing his advance with this threat behind him, Brunswick turned his army around to face the French forces head. This, he believed, presented a golden opportunity to completely destroy the revolutionary army, which had never before managed to hold its ground in a major battle. In the early morning hours of September 20th, thick fog covered the rolling hills surrounding the village of Valmy. Brunswick's advanced units, marching eastward, unexpectedly encountered General Valence's troops defending the village of La Lune. Valence commanded veterans from the old Royal Army, and these experienced soldiers put up fierce resistance. Their determined fighting bought precious time for the rest of the French army to take defensive positions on a ridge just west of Valmy village. Brunswick had not anticipated such stubborn resistance from the French forces. He decided to wait until more of his troops arrived before launching a full-scale assault. The two armies were now almost perfectly matched in size. Approximately 36,000 French soldiers facing 34,000 Prussian. Both sides brought their artillery into position. 40 French cannons against 56 Prussian guns. Although the Prussians had more artillery pieces, The French guns held better positions on the high ground. The French artillery corps had also been less disrupted by the revolution than other military branches. These gunners were experienced, and equipped with superior weapons thanks to the famous Greboval system, which had modernized and standardized French artillery equipment. As both armies opened fire with a thunderous barrage, Dumouriez and Kellerman rode back and forth along their battle lines. They deliberately exposed themselves to flying cannonballs, encouraging their men to stand firm under the intense bombardment. French troops demonstrated their determination by loudly singing a new revolutionary anthem that had become wildly popular that summer, La Marseillaise. As the artillery battle continued for hours, it became increasingly clear that the French forces would not break easily under pressure. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Brunswick ordered a general infantry advance. The Prussian foot soldiers immediately came under devastating fire from French cannons. With each step forward, more and more men were cut down by deadly cannonballs. After advancing only a few hundred yards, Brunswick realized that continuing the attack would cost too many lives and ordered his forces to halt. For the first time since the war had begun, the French army had successfully thrown back an enemy attack. But the battle wasn't over yet. A Prussian cannonball struck a French ammunition wagon, causing a massive explosion. Soldiers were knocked to the ground by the blast, and the artillery duel stopped briefly as men on both sides stared in amazement at the enormous explosion. A Prussian officer urged Brunswick to take advantage of this moment of confusion and press the attack, but the Duke hesitated, uncertain whether to continue. Meanwhile, a young French officer, who would later become King Louis Philippe, rode up with 2 batteries of horse artillery to strengthen the French defensive line. Kellerman was also on the scene, raising his hat high and shouting "Long live the nation" to rally his troops. In previous battles, French forces had fled at the first sign of serious danger. At Valmy, something different happened. They held their ground. From the experienced Royal Army veterans to the raw civilian volunteers, from the exhausted artillery crews to the brave commanding generals, everyone stood firm. At 5 o'clock in the evening, with the rain beginning to fall and ammunition running dangerously low, the firing gradually died out on both sides. Valmy had not been a large or particularly costly battle in terms of casualties. Both armies suffered only a few hundred losses each. Some military historians even debate whether it should be considered a real battle at all, but it represented a crucial turning point for the French Revolution. At the moment when the revolution's very survival hung in the balance, the Revolutionary Army, strengthened by experienced soldiers from the old royal forces, had successfully held its position and stopped the enemy invasion. The day after this victory, emboldened by news of their army's success, France's new National Convention took a historic step. They officially abolished the monarchy and proclaimed France a republic. The French army then withdrew to stronger defensive positions further back. The Prussian forces were left to fend for themselves in hostile territory, far from their supply bases. Heavy rains continued to batter both armies throughout September, while desertion and disease reduced Brunswick's main force to just 17,000 effective soldiers. The Prussian commander had seen enough. He had no choice but to begin his retreat from French soil. Brunswick's trained troops were too valuable to waste on a mission that couldn't succeed. Besides, there were bigger problems brewing in Eastern Europe. Poland was facing another division, and that needed attention. So Brunswick made the call to pull back. On October 23rd, the final coalition forces crossed back over the Rhine River into Germany. It would be over 20 years before another coalition army would get that close to Paris again. More than 3 million people would lose their lives before that happened. That's how significant Brunswick's advance was in the fall of 1792. Want to see brand new, epic history videos before anyone else? Want to watch them weeks before they go live on YouTube? We've got something special for you. There is a new episode in our Rise of China series that covers China's brutal war with Japan. This conflict killed millions and saw terrible war crimes. Even though China was one of the 5 major Allied powers, people in the West still don't know much about their role in World War II. You can watch this video right now on Nebula. That's where all our newest content goes first. Nebula is a streaming platform made by creators like us. This means you'll only find top quality videos there. Real people make these videos with care and passion about topics that matter, and there are no ads to interrupt your viewing. We really think you should check out Real Life Law's Modern Conflicts series. Their recent episodes break down what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine with expert analysis. They release a new episode every month, so you'll stay current with world events. Plus, you'll learn about interesting conflicts from history. Their newest release tells the amazing story of drug lord Elch. They use great footage and stunning visuals to bring the story to life. This episode is a Nebula original, which means you can't watch it anywhere else. More and more videos in this series are becoming exclusive to Nebula. Nebula has hundreds of other great creators covering every topic you can think of. Whether you want original movies and shows, documentaries about travel, gaming, technology, or history, you'll find something you love. There's also a growing collection of Nebula originals that only subscribers can watch. We have a special deal just for Epic History viewers. Click the link in our description to get 40% off Nebula's yearly plan. That's only $36 for the whole year, which breaks down to just $3 per month. If you want an even better deal, the The lifetime plan gives you access forever for $300 with no hidden fees. Here's something cool. All Nebula subscribers now get a monthly guest pass. You can share this with a friend and they get full access to Nebula for an entire week. This means you can share your favorite videos with the people you care about. We want to thank everyone who already subscribes to Nebula. For those who haven't joined yet, we hope to see you there soon. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Special thanks to our builders like Jonathan Williams, Craze Lizard, and Kevin Tron. Thanks to our citizens like Matthew, Leo, Ulysses Yu, and Eric Davidson. And thanks to our heroes like Yuko Sin. You can join them by supporting us on Patreon. Supporters get early access to new videos without ads. You'll also get exclusive updates and get to vote on what topics we cover next.